The world of Olympia stood as a monument to human tenacity among the stars. A mountainous realm of jagged peaks and deep valleys, its settlements clung to cliffsides and plateaus like barnacles to a ship's hull. The feudal society that developed there was as harsh and unforgiving as the landscape itself, with city-states engaged in constant warfare for resources and territory. It was into this world that the Primarch pod containing the infant who would become known as Perturabo crashed, forever changing the course of Olympian history. The impact site was discovered by scouts serving Damikos, the tyrant of Lakos, the most powerful of Olympia's warlords. What they found was no ordinary child. Even as an infant, Perturabo displayed physical characteristics that marked him as something beyond human, larger, stronger, with eyes that seemed to contain unfathomable depths of knowledge. The scouts brought the child to their master, who recognized an opportunity when presented with one. Damikos, a cunning and ambitious ruler, formally adopted the child into his household. His decision was not born of compassion, but calculation. He recognized the potential value of this extraordinary foundling. The tyrant named the child Perturabo, a name whose origins remain unclear in imperial records, though some scholars suggest it may have had significance in ancient Olympian dialect, possibly relating to concepts of disruption or breaking through barriers. From his earliest moments of consciousness, Perturabo demonstrated intellectual capabilities that astounded all who witnessed them. While other children struggled with basic language acquisition, the young Primarch was already speaking in complete, complex sentences. By the age of 3, he had mastered multiple Olympian dialects and was correcting the mathematical calculations of Damikos engineers. There was no learning curve for Perturabo. He seemed to simply know things, as though vast repositories of knowledge had been encoded into his very being. The young Primarch's understanding of mathematics transcended what should have been possible. He could perform complex calculations instantly, visualizing multi-dimensional problems that even the most accomplished scholars of Olympia struggled to comprehend. When presented with architectural plans, he would immediately identify structural weaknesses and propose improvements that seasoned builders had overlooked. His spatial reasoning abilities were particularly remarkable. Perturabo could look at a mountain and instantly envision how to carve a fortress into it, accounting for defensive angles, resource management, and aesthetic considerations simultaneously. Perhaps most disturbing to those around him was Perturabo's innate grasp of warfare. Having never seen battle, the child could nonetheless describe advanced military strategies and tactics with the confidence of a seasoned general. He would examine maps of Olympia and point out strategic weaknesses in various city-states' defenses, explaining precisely how they could be exploited. Damikos initially found these insights amusing, but as Perturabo grew and his assessments proved consistently accurate, the tyrant began to take serious note of his adopted son's military acumen. Unlike many of his Primarch brothers who were discovered in their respective worlds, Perturabo never experienced a true childhood. He did not play with toys or engage in the normal developmental activities of human children. Instead, he spent his early years absorbing knowledge at a prodigious rate, studying the architectural achievements of ancient Olympia, mastering the principles of engineering, and analyzing the military histories of his adopted homeworld. One of the few meaningful personal connections Perturabo formed during these formative years was with his foster sister, Caliphone. Unlike Damikos, who viewed the young Primarch primarily as an asset, Caliphone treated Perturabo with genuine kindness. She was several years older than him in biological terms, though his accelerated development soon erased any apparent age gap. Caliphone became Perturabo's window into human emotion and social interaction, areas where his superhuman intellect offered him no inherent advantage. Their relationship was complex but genuine. Caliphone never feared Perturabo's intellect or physical presence, instead challenging him when his logic became too cold or detached from human concerns. She would debate philosophy with him, arguing that beauty and art had value beyond pure function, concepts that the young Primarch struggled to fully embrace. For his part, Perturabo found in Caliphone someone who saw him as more than a tool or weapon, someone who valued him for reasons beyond his utility. This stood in stark contrast to his relationship with Damikos. The tyrant of Lakos was quick to exploit Perturabo's gifts, parading him before other warlords as a demonstration of his house's superiority. He consulted the young Primarch on matters of state and warfare, implementing his suggestions while taking credit for the resulting successes. Damikos never attempted to understand Perturabo as an individual with his own desires and ambitions. He saw only the advantage that such a being could provide to his political machinations. As Perturabo matured, this dynamic fostered a deep resentment. The Primarch came to understand that his adopted father viewed him as nothing more than a particularly valuable possession. Damikos would speak of Perturabo as "my son" when it suited his purposes, but his actions revealed the true nature of their relationship, master and tool. The young Primarch's bitterness grew quietly, manifesting not in outbursts of anger, but in a deepening emotional withdrawal and growing contempt for those around him. This resentment was compounded by Perturabo's growing awareness of his own nature. He knew instinctively that he was not of Olympia, that he had been created for some greater purpose. He felt the pull of distant stars and would often spend nights staring at the sky, sensing connections he could not yet fully comprehend. This feeling of displacement, of being fundamentally separate from the society in which he found himself, only intensified his isolation. Despite these emotional complications, Perturabo's intellect continued to express itself through creation. By the time he reached what would be adolescence in a normal human, he had already designed and overseen the construction of several architectural marvels across Olympia. His first major work was the redesign of Lakos' defensive walls, transforming them from adequate fortifications into a masterpiece of military engineering. The new walls incorporated advanced principles of defensive architecture, overlapping fields of fire, cunningly designed killing grounds, and hidden redoubts that could trap attackers in deadly crossfires. The success of this project led to more ambitious undertakings. Perturabo designed a network of aqueducts that brought fresh water from mountain springs to the drought-prone lower cities, solving a resource problem that had plagued Olympia for generations. He created new methods of mining that allowed for the extraction of previously inaccessible mineral deposits, dramatically increasing Damikos' wealth and power. Each achievement brought acclaim to the tyrant's house, while Perturabo himself received little recognition beyond the walls of Lakos. Perhaps the most remarkable of Perturabo's early creations was the Observatory of Lakos. Built atop the highest peak near the city, this structure housed sophisticated astronomical instruments of the Primarch's own design. The observatory allowed for detailed mapping of Olympia's night sky, but Perturabo spent countless hours there for reasons beyond mere scientific curiosity. Something in him knew that his destiny lay among those distant stars, and the observatory became his sanctuary, a place where he could contemplate the greater universe away from the petty politics of his adopted father's court. The construction of the observatory revealed another aspect of Perturabo's character that would define him in later years: his obsession with perfection and his harsh treatment of those who failed to meet his exacting standards. Workers who made errors in implementing his designs faced severe consequences, as the Primarch could not comprehend how others could fail to execute what seemed so obvious to him. This lack of patience with human limitation would later manifest in his leadership of the Iron Warriors Legion, where his demands for perfection would drive his sons to both greatness and despair. As his reputation grew, Perturabo was increasingly called upon to create instruments of war. He designed siege engines of unprecedented power, armored vehicles that could traverse Olympia's treacherous mountain passes, and weapons that revolutionized warfare on the planet. Each innovation further cemented Damikos' position as the dominant power on Olympia, as rival city-states could not match the military technology that Perturabo provided. Yet even as he created these engines of destruction, Perturabo harbored dreams of building rather than destroying. In private moments, he would sketch designs for magnificent cities, educational institutions, and public works that could elevate Olympian society beyond its constant warfare. He shared these visions with Caliphone, who encouraged him to present them to Damikos. The tyrant, however, had little interest in projects that did not directly enhance his military power or personal prestige. This rejection of his more constructive ambitions further deepened the divide between Perturabo and his adopted father. The Primarch came to see Damikos as emblematic of humanity's self-destructive tendencies, the prioritization of power over progress, of conquest over creation. Yet even as he judged the tyrant harshly, Perturabo found himself complicit in enabling the very behaviors he despised, creating ever more effective tools of warfare at Damikos' behest. By the time he reached physical maturity, Perturabo had become a study in contradiction. His intellect allowed him to create works of breathtaking genius, yet he found little joy in his achievements. He possessed the capacity to transform Olympian society for the better, yet found himself serving the ambitions of a ruler he increasingly despised. He craved recognition for his abilities, yet withdrew from those who might offer genuine connection or appreciation. These internal conflicts manifested in Perturabo's demeanor and habits. He became increasingly taciturn, speaking only when necessary and offering little insight into his thoughts or feelings. He developed a habit of working in isolation, often for days at a time without rest or sustenance, emerging only when a project was completed to his satisfaction. His rare moments of interaction with others became tense affairs, as few could meet his exacting standards or comprehend the scope of his vision. Throughout this period, only Caliphone maintained a meaningful connection with the Primarch. She remained unafraid to challenge him, to question his withdrawal from human connection, and to remind him of the potential his gifts held for purposes beyond warfare. Their relationship became increasingly strained as Perturabo's bitterness grew, but it remained the one thread connecting him to the emotional reality of those around him. As tensions between Lacos and rival city-states escalated, Perturabo found himself drawn more directly into military affairs. No longer content to merely design weapons and fortifications, he began to develop strategic battle plans for Damikos' armies. His approach to warfare reflected the same precision and efficiency that characterized his engineering work, methodical, calculating, and utterly without mercy. When implemented, his strategies proved devastatingly effective, earning him a fearsome reputation across Olympia. The day that changed Perturabo's life forever came without warning. The skies above Olympia blazed with golden light as a fleet of massive vessels descended through the atmosphere. Their hulls gleamed with imperial iconography unknown to the Olympians, who watched in awe and terror as these messengers from the stars approached. At the forefront of this celestial procession was the master of mankind himself, the Emperor, come to reclaim his lost son. Perturabo stood atop the highest tower of Damikos' fortress, his transhuman eyes able to discern details invisible to normal humans. He observed the precise formation of the ships, noted the efficiency of their landing procedures, and calculated the tactical significance of their deployment pattern. Yet beneath these analytical observations stirred something deeper, a primal recognition that transcended conscious thought. When the Emperor's shuttle finally touched down on Olympian soil, Perturabo felt a sensation entirely new to him, certainty of purpose. As the master of mankind emerged, resplendent in his golden armor, Perturabo knew immediately who stood before him. Unlike some of his brother Primarchs who required explanation or convincing, Perturabo recognized his gene father instantly. The connection between them was immediate and undeniable, a biological recognition coded into the very structure of his being. The meeting between Primarch and Emperor was witnessed by Damikos and the nobility of Lacos, who stood in stunned silence as the two transhuman beings regarded each other. No words were necessary between father and son in those first moments. The Emperor saw in Perturabo the fulfillment of his design, a mind of unparalleled analytical brilliance housed in a body engineered for conquest. Perturabo, in turn, saw in the Emperor the answer to the questions that had haunted him since consciousness, the source of his otherworldly abilities and the purpose for which he had been created. When they finally spoke, the Emperor explained to Perturabo his true heritage. He described the Primarch project, the scattering of the 20 gene suns across the galaxy, and the great crusade to reunite humanity under the banner of the Imperium. Each revelation struck Perturabo with the force of absolute truth, confirming suspicions he had harbored throughout his life on Olympia. He was not an anomaly or an outsider. He was a weapon forged by the greatest mind in human history, designed to conquer the stars. The Emperor then revealed to Perturabo the legion created from his genetic template, the 4th Legion Astartes, warriors who carried his blood and were crafted to embody his particular strengths. This knowledge filled the Primarch with a strange mixture of pride and responsibility. Here were sons he had never known, waiting for his guidance and leadership. The Emperor explained that upon accepting his rightful place, Perturabo would take command of these warriors and lead them in the Great Crusade. Damikos, ever the political opportunist, attempted to negotiate favorable terms for Olympia's incorporation into the Imperium. He presented himself as Perturabo's mentor and guide, implying a closeness that had never existed. The Emperor, with his penetrating psychic awareness, undoubtedly sensed the falseness of these claims, but political expediency demanded diplomacy. Olympia would join the Imperium peacefully, becoming a valuable recruitment world for the Legion that would soon bear Perturabo's imprint. For Perturabo himself, the decision to leave Olympia required little deliberation. This world had been his prison, not his home, a place where his gifts had been exploited rather than celebrated. Only his relationship with Caliphone gave him pause. In a rare display of emotional vulnerability, Perturabo bid farewell to his foster sister, acknowledging that their paths must now diverge. Caliphone, with characteristic insight, recognized both the opportunity and the danger this new path presented to her brother. She cautioned him against allowing his resentments to dictate his future actions, advice that would prove prophetic in the years to come. Within days of the Emperor's arrival, Perturabo departed Olympia aboard the flagship of the Imperial fleet. He left behind the world of his upbringing without nostalgia or regret, his gaze fixed firmly on the future that awaited among the stars. Damikos remained as ruler of Olympia, now a planetary governor in service to the Imperium, while Perturabo ascended to his destined role as a general in the Emperor's Great Crusade. The Primarch's first meeting with his legion occurred aboard the massive vessel Contrador, then serving as the 4th Legion's flagship. The warriors who assembled before him were battle-hardened veterans of the Great Crusade, Astartes who had fought for decades without their Primarch's guidance. They had developed a reputation as determined and reliable siege specialists, but their campaigns had come at a terrible cost. The 4th Legion had been used as attrition troops, thrown against the most heavily fortified enemy positions with little regard for casualties. Perturabo observed his sons with a critical eye, noting both their strengths and deficiencies. He saw in them a reflection of himself, beings of tremendous potential whose talents had been narrowly channeled and inadequately appreciated. The Legion's command structure was functional but uninspired, their tactics effective but lacking innovation, their equipment practical but without elegance. They were tools being used until they broke, then discarded and replaced. In his first address to the assembled Legion, Perturabo declared that this era of thankless sacrifice would end. From this moment forward, they would be known as the Iron Warriors, a name that reflected both their unyielding nature and their Primarch's appreciation for the fundamental materials of creation. They would continue to serve as the Emperor's siege specialists, but they would do so with strategies that preserved their strength rather than squandering it. They would become masters of warfare's most challenging discipline, practitioners of a deadly art form rather than mere expendable assets. The transformation of the 4th Legion began immediately and proceeded with characteristic thoroughness. Perturabo immersed himself in all aspects of Legion operations, working without rest to understand every facet of his inherited command. He reviewed battle records, equipment specifications, recruitment procedures, and training protocols. He interviewed officers at all levels, assessed the Legion's fleet capabilities, and examined supply chains and logistical systems. Nothing escaped his analytical gaze. What emerged from this comprehensive evaluation was a plan for complete reorganization. Perturabo restructured the Legion's command hierarchy, replacing the traditional companies with grand battalions, larger formations capable of operating independently for extended campaigns. Each grand battalion was designed to function as a self-contained military force, with its own armor, artillery, support personnel, and technical specialists. This structure allowed the Iron Warriors to simultaneously engage multiple objectives across vast distances, maximizing their effectiveness in the sprawling theater of the Great Crusade. Perturabo personally redesigned the Legion's iconography, replacing the simple iconography of the 4th Legion with the stark, geometric chevron pattern that would become synonymous with the Iron Warriors. This symbol, reminiscent of a fortress wall viewed from above, represented both the Legion's specialization and their Primarch's commitment to unadorned functionality. The Iron Warriors would wear this emblem with pride, a visual declaration of their identity and purpose. The Primarch also instituted sweeping changes to the Legion's training regimen. Drawing on his experiences on Olympia, he developed exercises that emphasized mathematical precision in all aspects of warfare. Iron Warriors were drilled relentlessly in ballistics calculations, structural analysis, and siege engineering. Every Astartes was expected to understand not just how to destroy a fortification, but how to build one, knowledge that would prove invaluable in identifying weaknesses in enemy defenses. These changes were not implemented without resistance. Veterans who had served since the Legion's founding questioned the need for such dramatic restructuring, while officers who lost position or influence in the reorganization harbored resentments. Perturabo met this opposition with cold logic and unwavering determination. Those who could adapt to his vision were retained and elevated. Those who could not were reassigned to non-command roles, or in some cases, removed entirely through suicidal combat assignments, an early indication of the ruthless pragmatism that would characterize his leadership. The true test of Perturabo's reforms came in the Legion's first campaign under his command, the compliance of the Sactrata Deeps, a cluster of heavily fortified worlds that had resisted Imperial integration for decades. Previous attempts at bringing these planets to compliance had failed, with Imperial forces unable to breach the sophisticated defensive networks that protected the cluster's primary worlds. Perturabo approached this challenge methodically, beginning with a comprehensive analysis of the enemy's defensive capabilities. He identified not just the obvious fortifications, but the underlying support systems that made them effective: power generation facilities, communication networks, supply caches, and troop rotation schedules. Rather than launching a direct assault on the most heavily defended positions, as had been attempted previously, he developed a strategy that systematically isolated and neutralized these support systems. The Iron Warriors struck with precision and coordination that stunned both their enemies and Imperial observers. Artillery barrages were timed to the second, undermining operations penetrated defenses at exactly calculated weak points, and assault forces exploited breaches with mechanical efficiency. Within weeks, fortifications that had withstood years of Imperial sieges began to fall. By the campaign's conclusion 3 months later, the entire cluster had been brought to compliance with casualties far below previous estimates. This victory established a template for Iron Warriors operations that would be refined and expanded throughout the Great Crusade. Perturabo's Legion became synonymous with methodical, inexorable conquest, a force that approached warfare as a problem of engineering rather than a test of martial prowess. Where other legions might seek glory in dramatic assaults or heroic last stands, the Iron Warriors found satisfaction in the perfect execution of carefully calculated plans. The Legion's growing reputation for siegecraft led to increasing demands for their specialized skills. As the Great Crusade encountered more heavily fortified human worlds and Xeno's strongholds, the Iron Warriors were repeatedly called upon to break deadlocks and overcome seemingly impregnable defenses. Perturabo's sons became experts in all aspects of siege warfare, from the construction of massive artillery pieces capable of breaching void shields to the development of specialized tunneling vehicles that could penetrate deep beneath enemy fortifications. This specialization extended beyond offensive operations. The Iron Warriors became the Imperium's premier fortress builders, constructing defensive works on newly compliant worlds that combined functional efficiency with imposing psychological impact. These fortresses served both practical and symbolic purposes. They secured Imperial holdings against potential rebellion, while demonstrating the Imperium's permanence and technological superiority to recently conquered populations. Perturabo personally designed many of these structures, applying the architectural genius he had displayed on Olympia on a grander scale. Each fortress incorporated advanced defensive principles while reflecting the specific environmental challenges of its location. On toxic worlds, he created self-contained citadels with sophisticated atmospheric filtration systems. On tectonically unstable planets, he designed structures that could adapt to shifting ground conditions. In asteroid belts, he hollowed out massive rocks and transformed them into virtually impregnable monitoring stations. The construction of these fortresses revealed another aspect of Perturabo's character that would shape his legion's development: his unflagging attention to detail and unwillingness to accept anything less than perfection. Iron warriors assigned to construction duties found themselves held to standards that seemed impossible to normal humans, but were merely baseline expectations for their Primarch. Errors in execution, no matter how minor, were met with harsh punishment. This unforgiving approach produced magnificent results, but fostered a culture of fear and resentment that permeated the Legion's ranks. The Great Crusade ground forward across the galaxy, a relentless machine of conquest, with the Iron Warriors increasingly serving as its battering ram. While other legions might be deployed to swift victories or diplomatic triumphs, Perturabo's sons were consistently assigned to the most grueling and thankless campaigns in the expanding Imperium. Where resistance was fiercest, where fortifications were most formidable, there the Iron Warriors would be sent to break the deadlock. Perturabo's legion developed specialized methodologies for siege warfare that transformed it from brute force endeavor to precise science. Their approach began with exhaustive intelligence gathering. Orbital scans, infiltration teams, and captured enemy records were compiled to create comprehensive models of target fortifications. The Primarch himself would often spend days analyzing these models, identifying structural weaknesses and optimal points of attack. When the actual assault began, it followed a meticulously choreographed sequence, with each element timed to the second. The Iron Warrior siege trains became legendary during this period. Massive artillery pieces of Perturabo's own design, the Perturabo hammer, the Olympian bombard, the Tyrant siege terminator, could reduce the most hardened fortifications to rubble with mathematical precision. These weapons were complemented by specialized assault vehicles, undermining equipment, and breaching technologies that gave the 4th Legion unmatched capabilities in siege warfare. One such campaign that exemplified the Iron Warriors' growing expertise was the compliance of Galgiz, a heavily fortified world whose defensive systems had repelled 3 previous Imperial expeditions. The planet's ruling technocracy had constructed a network of interlocking fortresses that covered nearly a third of the habitable landmass, each supporting the others with overlapping fields of fire. Previous Imperial commanders had attempted to overwhelm these defenses with frontal assaults, resulting in catastrophic casualties. Perturabo approached the problem differently. After a week of observation, he identified that the entire defensive network depended on a sophisticated central command system buried deep beneath the planet's primary mountain range. Rather than attacking the visible fortresses, he deployed the majority of his forces in a diversionary pattern, while a specialized strike force infiltrated the subterranean command complex through mining tunnels that the defenders believed impassable. The operation succeeded perfectly. The central command system was neutralized, throwing the defensive network into disarray. With their coordinated fire control systems disabled, the individual fortresses became vulnerable to targeted strikes. Within 3 weeks, a world that had resisted compliance for decades was brought into the Imperial fold with minimal Iron Warrior casualties. This victory, like many others achieved by the 4th Legion, received little recognition from the wider Imperium. While other Primarchs returned to Terra to celebrations and triumphal parades, Perturabo and his sons were simply assigned their next grinding campaign. This pattern of thankless service began to wear on the Legion's morale, feeding into their Primarch's existing sense of being undervalued and exploited. The Iron Warriors' growing bitterness was compounded by their assignment to garrison duty on newly compliant worlds. As the Emperor's foremost experts in fortification, they were tasked with constructing and manning defensive structures across the expanding Imperium. These assignments split the Legion across hundreds of worlds, with small detachments responsible for maintaining Imperial control over potentially rebellious populations. Garrison duty was monotonous, inglorious work that offered none of the brotherhood or purpose that defined Astartes' service. Iron Warriors found themselves serving as glorified prison guards, their transhuman abilities wasted on duties that mortal soldiers could have performed. Years might pass without meaningful combat or the presence of their Primarch, leading to a growing sense of isolation and resentment. Perturabo was well aware of the toll these assignments took on his legion, but approached the problem with characteristic pragmatism. He instituted a rotation system that limited garrison deployments to 5 years, ensuring that no Iron Warrior would be permanently consigned to such duty. He also standardized the design of garrison fortresses to allow for more efficient construction, reducing the number of Astartes required for each assignment. These measures mitigated but did not eliminate the fundamental problem. The Iron Warriors were being used as a resource to be expended rather than a legion to be honored. Perturabo's sons internalized their Primarch's sense that they were viewed as expendable tools by the wider Imperium, creating a culture of grim determination and bitter pride. If they would not receive glory, they would at least earn respect through unfailing effectiveness. This mentality was reflected in the Iron Warriors' approach to casualties. Where other legions might withdraw from untenable positions to preserve their strength, Perturabo's sons held their ground regardless of losses. Failure was not an option, regardless of the cost in Astartes' lives. This unyielding determination made them invaluable for holding critical objectives, but resulted in attrition rates that far exceeded those of other legions. The 4th Legion's losses were staggering by any measure. During the compliance of the Untamed Stars sector, an entire Grand Battalion was lost securing a vital supply route. In the Graveyard Campaign against Orc forces in the Terran Nebula, nearly 3,000 Iron Warriors fell breaking the Xenos' strongholds. At the Battle of Sheol's Gate, the Legion suffered 35% casualties in a single day of fighting against heavily fortified Separatist forces. Perturabo's response to these losses was not to modify his tactics, but to increase recruitment. The Iron Warriors began drawing heavily from Olympia and other worlds with similar harsh environments, seeking recruits who already possessed the mental fortitude to endure the Legion's demanding standards. The induction process was deliberately brutal, designed to weed out any weakness before it could manifest in combat. Only 1 in 10 aspirants survived to become full battle brothers, but those who emerged were among the most resilient and determined warriors in the Imperium. This accelerated recruitment allowed the Iron Warriors to maintain their operational tempo despite catastrophic losses, but it came with costs beyond the purely numerical. The Legion's culture became increasingly dominated by newer warriors who had known only the bitterness and pragmatism of Perturabo's leadership, with fewer veterans remaining to provide perspective or institutional memory. The brotherhood that defined other legions was replaced by a grim professionalism. Iron Warriors fought alongside their battle brothers not out of love or shared ideals, but because it was the most efficient way to accomplish their assigned objectives. Perturabo himself remained largely detached from the emotional reality of his sons. He designed strategies that treated them as assets to be deployed rather than warriors to be led, calculating acceptable casualty rates with the same cold precision he applied to ammunition expenditure or fuel consumption. This approach was brutally effective in military terms, but further alienated a legion already struggling with its identity and purpose. As the Great Crusade progressed, the Iron Warriors increasingly found themselves compared to the Imperial Fists, the 7th Legion commanded by Rogel Dorn. Both legions specialized in siege warfare and fortification, but their approaches and reputations could not have been more different. Where the Iron Warriors were assigned to the most brutal meat grinder campaigns, the Imperial Fists received prestigious assignments and public recognition. Where Perturabo's sons manned thankless garrison posts across the Imperium, Dorn's warriors were entrusted with the defense of Terra itself. The rivalry between the 4th and 7th Legions began as professional competition, but grew into something more personal and bitter. Perturabo studied reports of Imperial Fist's campaigns with obsessive attention, identifying what he perceived as inefficiencies or errors in Dorn's approach. He became convinced that his own legion's methods were superior in every measurable aspect, yet the Imperium continued to heap praise on the Seventh while ignoring the contributions of the Iron Warriors. This professional rivalry escalated dramatically following the compliance of Shravan. This heavily fortified world had resisted Imperial integration for decades, its population protected by a network of defensive structures that combined ancient technologies with modern innovations. The campaign to bring Shravan into compliance was initially assigned to the Iron Warriors, who developed a comprehensive strategy for systematically reducing the planet's defenses. Before this plan could be implemented, however, command of the campaign was reassigned to the Imperial Fists. Dorn's legion approached the problem differently, focusing on a single decisive strike against the planetary capital rather than the methodical reduction favored by the Iron Warriors. The strategy succeeded, bringing Shravan to compliance weeks ahead of Perturabo's projected timeline. In the aftermath, Rogel Dorn was asked to evaluate the Iron Warriors' original battle plan. His assessment was brutally honest. He identified what he saw as unnecessary complications and overly conservative approaches. When these comments reached Perturabo, they struck at the core of his professional pride. The perceived slight festered in the Primarch's mind, transforming professional disagreement into personal animosity. The tension between the two Primarchs came to a head during a rare gathering of multiple Legion forces for the compliance of the Tellarus cluster. In a strategic planning session, Perturabo and Dorn clashed over the optimal approach to reducing the cluster's formidable orbital defenses. What began as a technical discussion escalated into a bitter argument that revealed the depth of Perturabo's resentment. Dorn, with his characteristic directness, seemed genuinely puzzled by his brother's hostility. From his perspective, he had offered nothing but honest professional assessment, unaware of how deeply his words had wounded Perturabo's pride. The Lord of the Imperial Fists valued his brother's technical expertise, but found his sensitivity to criticism perplexing in a being created for war. For Perturabo, Dorn embodied everything he resented about his position in the Great Crusade. The Seventh Primarch received recognition that the Lord of Iron felt he had earned but been denied. Dorn's fortresses were celebrated as wonders, while the Iron Warriors' works were treated as mere infrastructure. The Imperial Fists fought glorious campaigns of conquest, while the Fourth Legion was assigned to grinding attrition warfare. Most galling of all, Dorn seemed completely unaware of this disparity, accepting the Imperium's favor as his due while dismissing Perturabo's achievements. This rivalry might have remained a private matter between Primarchs had it not infected their respective legions. Iron Warriors began to measure themselves against the Imperial Fists, seeking to prove their superiority through ever more impressive feats of engineering and military efficiency. When the two legions operated in proximity, there was palpable tension that occasionally erupted into physical confrontations between battle brothers. Perturabo did nothing to discourage this competition. Indeed, he actively cultivated it, using the rivalry to drive his sons to greater efforts. Iron Warriors who distinguished themselves against Imperial Fists' forces received rare commendation, while those who failed were harshly punished. The Fourth Legion's identity became increasingly defined by this adversarial relationship, their sense of worth tied to outperforming their more celebrated counterparts. The practical impact of this rivalry manifested in the Iron Warriors' approach to warfare. Perturabo drove his legion to achieve objectives with mathematical precision, accepting higher casualties if it meant completing assignments faster or more efficiently than the Imperial Fists might have. Iron Warriors' fortresses became increasingly elaborate, incorporating defensive innovations specifically designed to counter tactics favored by Dorn's legion. Even the Fourth Legion's equipment reflected this competition, with modifications and improvements implemented specifically to outperform Imperial Fists' equivalents. The event that would forever alter the Iron Warriors' Legion culture occurred shortly after Perturabo assumed command. Upon formally taking control of his legion, the Lord of Iron spent weeks reviewing combat records, studying casualty reports, and observing training exercises. What he discovered troubled him deeply, not merely tactical inefficiencies, but what he perceived as fundamental weaknesses in discipline and mental fortitude. Perturabo summoned the entire legion to assembly on the parade grounds of Olympia. Nearly 90,000 Astartes stood in perfect formation, their newly adopted silver and iron heraldry gleaming under the harsh Olympian sun. Many expected a rousing address from their Gene father, perhaps outlining his vision for their future campaigns. What followed instead would be seared into the Legion's collective memory for millennia to come. The Primarch's voice carried across the assembled warriors with cold precision as he announced his judgment. The Fourth Legion had failed to meet the standards expected of the Emperor's chosen warriors. Their combat effectiveness was compromised by hesitation, their unity undermined by self-preservation. Such weakness could not be tolerated. The decimation order fell upon the stunned Legion like a thunderbolt. 1 in 10 warriors would die as punishment for the Legion's perceived failures. The selection would not be random. Each squad would select its weakest member, judged by his battle brothers. These warriors would then be beaten to death by their own comrades. Many senior officers were shocked into silence, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what their Primarch demanded. Some considered protest, but found themselves paralyzed by the implacable certainty in Perturabo's eyes. This was not a leader who would be swayed by appeals to mercy or brotherhood. The decimation would proceed. The psychological calculus behind Perturabo's decision revealed the cold pragmatism that would define his leadership. By forcing each squad to select its own victim, he created a brutal form of self-policing. Warriors who might have harbored doubts about their own abilities now faced the prospect of being judged wanting by those who knew them best. Survivors would carry the dual burden of having condemned a battle brother and participated in his execution. As the decimation began, the parade ground of Olympia became an abattoir. Battle brothers who had fought side by side for decades now turned on their selected comrades with brutal efficiency. The condemned faced their fate with varying degrees of acceptance. Some submitted willingly to what they viewed as the Primarch's justified judgment, while others fought desperately against the inevitable, requiring multiple warriors to subdue them. Perturabo observed the entire process without emotion, standing motionless as nearly 9,000 of his Gene's sons were beaten to death. He made no speeches to justify his decision, offered no words of consolation to the survivors. When the last condemned Astartes had fallen, he simply ordered the Legion to dispose of the bodies and prepare for immediate deployment. There would be no mourning period, no time to process the trauma. The Iron Warriors would move forward purged of weakness, or so their Primarch believed. The immediate aftermath of the decimation revealed its effectiveness as a tool of control, if not necessarily as a means of improvement. The surviving Iron Warriors displayed a rigid adherence to orders that bordered on the pathological. No warrior would risk being perceived as hesitant or uncertain, knowing that such judgment had condemned thousands of their brothers. Training exercises were conducted with a grim intensity that often resulted in casualties, even without enemy opposition. More insidious were the psychological changes that permeated Legion culture. Trust, already tenuous in a fighting force frequently split across countless garrison duties, now became virtually non-existent. Warriors who had selected comrades for execution questioned their own judgment, while those who had performed the killings wondered if they might be next. The bonds of brotherhood that sustained other legions through hardship were replaced by a complex web of suspicion, resentment, and fear. This transformation manifested in the Legion's combat doctrine. Iron Warriors became notorious for their disregard for casualties, both their own and those of any civilian populations caught in their path. If sacrifice was required to achieve an objective, it would be made without hesitation. Warriors who showed concern for the lives of their battle brothers were viewed with suspicion, their loyalty questioned. The decimation had created a force that valued efficiency above all else, including the lives of its own members. Perturabo reinforced this mindset through his personal command style. He issued orders with mathematical precision, expecting them to be executed exactly as specified regardless of changing battlefield conditions. Warriors who achieved objectives through methods other than those he prescribed found themselves subject to harsh discipline rather than commendation. Innovation was discouraged except when explicitly requested, initiative was treated as potential insubordination. Within the Legion's command structure, the decimation created a leadership cadre defined by absolute loyalty to Perturabo rather than tactical acumen or battlefield experience. Officers who had enthusiastically embraced the decimation were promoted, while those who had shown reluctance found themselves assigned to increasingly hazardous duties. This selection process elevated warriors who mirrored the Primarch's coldly logical approach to warfare, further reinforcing the Legion's growing reputation for brutality and dispassion. The psychological impact extended beyond the Legion's internal dynamics to their relationship with their Primarch. Before the decimation, many Iron Warriors had greeted Perturabo's arrival with cautious optimism, hoping their Gene Father would bring recognition and purpose to a legion that had long served as the Imperium's siege specialists. After witnessing his willingness to sacrifice thousands of his own sons to make a point, that hope curdled into a complex mixture of fear, respect, and resentment. Iron Warriors now viewed their Primarch as a remote and unpredictable figure whose approval could never truly be earned. They executed his orders with fanatical precision, not out of devotion, but self-preservation. Perturabo, already inclined toward emotional detachment, interpreted this rigid compliance as vindication of his methods, rather than recognizing it as the trauma response it truly was. The distance between Primarch and Legion widened into an unbridgeable chasm, with devastating consequences for both. Perhaps most telling was the contrast between the Iron Warriors' decimation and disciplinary measures employed by other legions. When faced with failures or setbacks, Primarchs like Guilliman or the Khan implemented targeted corrections, addressing specific deficiencies while preserving their legion's morale and cohesion. Even the notoriously demanding Angron never instituted systematic punishment on the scale of Perturabo's decimation. The uniquely destructive nature of this action spoke to something broken in the relationship between the Lord of Iron and his sons from its very inception. In the months following the decimation, the Iron Warriors were deployed to a series of grinding compliance actions that tested their new ethos. The compliance of K. Venland became emblematic of their transformed approach. This heavily fortified world had resisted Imperial integration for decades behind a network of planetary defense batteries that had crippled 3 previous expedition fleets. Traditional siege doctrine suggested a methodical reduction of these defenses to minimize casualties. Perturabo's strategy discarded such considerations entirely. He ordered simultaneous assaults on all major defense batteries, knowing that such attacks would result in catastrophic casualties, but would overwhelm the defenders' command and control systems. Iron Warriors advanced across open ground into withering fire, neither seeking cover nor retreating when formations were decimated. Wave after wave of Astartes were sacrificed to exhaust the defenders' ammunition supplies and targeting capabilities. The approach worked with brutal efficiency. Within 3 days, K. Venland's orbital defenses were neutralized, though at the cost of nearly 30% of the deployed Iron Warriors' forces. Where other legions might have paused to regroup and honor their fallen, Perturabo immediately ordered the survivors to begin construction of compliance fortifications. There would be no recognition of sacrifice, no acknowledgement of loss, only the cold calculus of objectives achieved. This pattern repeated across dozens of compliance actions. Iron Warriors became the Emperor's sledgehammer, deployed against the most heavily fortified targets with the expectation of success regardless of cost. Their casualty rates far exceeded those of other legions, but their effectiveness could not be denied. Worlds that had resisted compliance for years fell within weeks to the relentless, methodical assaults of the 4th Legion. For Perturabo himself, the decimation marked the beginning of a period of increasing paranoia and resentment. He obsessively monitored reports from other Legion campaigns, particularly those of the Imperial Fists, searching for evidence that his warriors were being held to higher standards or assigned more difficult objectives. Each commendation granted to Dorn's Legion, while the Iron Warrior's sacrifices went unrecognized, deepened his conviction that the Emperor and his brothers viewed him as a tool rather than a son. This paranoia extended to his relationship with his own officers. Perturabo began maintaining extensive surveillance networks within the Legion, monitoring Vox communications and requiring detailed reports of even minor operations. Warriors who displayed independent thought or questioned orders, even when tactically justified, found themselves reassigned to virtual suicide missions. The Primarch's inner circle shrank to include only those who reinforced his perceptions and implemented his will without question. The decimation's aftermath revealed itself most clearly in the Iron Warriors' approach to garrison duty. Where previously such assignments had been viewed with resentment, but executed professionally, post-decimation garrisons became notorious for their brutality. Populations under Iron Warrior control learned to fear the silver and iron of the 4th Legion more than the enemies they ostensibly provided protection from. Compliance was enforced through exemplary punishment. Infrastructure was built with slave labor worked to death in conditions of unimaginable harshness. Particularly troubling was the Legion's growing disregard for civilian casualties during compliance actions. Iron Warriors' artillery would target population centers to break enemy morale, while assault forces made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants when clearing urban areas. Such tactics were justified through the cold logic that had become the Legion's hallmark: a faster compliance, regardless of civilian deaths, ultimately saved more lives by shortening conflicts. That this reasoning mirrored Perturabo's justification for the decimation was no coincidence. The transformation of the Iron Warriors did not go unnoticed by their brother legions. Astartes from other forces who fought alongside the 4th found themselves disturbed by their allies' dispassionate brutality and willingness to sacrifice their own warriors. Joint operations became increasingly rare as commanders from other legions requested alternative support rather than deal with the Iron Warriors' methods. This isolation further reinforced Perturabo's perception that his legion was deliberately marginalized within the Great Crusade. Perhaps most significant was the change in the legion's recruitment practices. Before the decimation, the Iron Warriors had drawn aspirants from across the Imperium, with a preference for those from challenging environments who displayed aptitude for mathematics and engineering. In the aftermath, recruitment focused almost exclusively on Olympia, specifically targeting youths from the most brutalizing circumstances who had already demonstrated the capacity for merciless efficiency that now defined the Legion. The training of these recruits emphasized absolute obedience and emotional detachment. Aspirants were deliberately placed in no-win scenarios where they were forced to sacrifice comrades to achieve objectives. Those who hesitated were eliminated, those who complied without question advanced. By the time these recruits became full battle brothers, they had been conditioned to view Legion culture not as a perversion of Astartes' brotherhood, but as its purest expression, war stripped of sentiment, duty untainted by emotion. As the Great Crusade progressed, the Iron Warriors became increasingly defined by their brutal efficiency and disregard for casualties. Their reputation spread across the expanding Imperium, not as heroes, but as implacable enforcers to be feared. Compliance meant survival. Resistance meant annihilation carried out with mathematical precision. The decimation had transformed a legion of siege specialists into a weapon of terror, its warriors as coldly calculating as the Primarch who had remade them in his image. The orbital view of Olympia had changed little since Perturabo's departure. The jagged mountain ranges still carved the planet's surface into irregular territories. The city-states still clung to their precarious perches on cliffs and plateaus. Yet as the Iron Warriors' fleet entered the system, their Primarch sensed something amiss in his former home. Routine Vox checks went unanswered. Orbital monitoring stations failed to transmit recognition codes. The planet's defense grid remained dormant when it should have activated upon the fleet's approach. Perturabo stood motionless on the bridge of his flagship, the Iron Blood, his massive frame silhouetted against the tactical display. His face betrayed no emotion as he processed the incoming data, but those who served him longest recognized the subtle tension in his posture. Something had happened on Olympia, something significant enough to disrupt Imperial communications protocols. "Prepare a full Legion deployment," he ordered, his voice carrying the cold precision that had become his hallmark. All Grand Battalions to establish landing zones at predetermined coordinates. armored elements to deploy first, followed by infantry and siege equipment. The preparations proceeded with mechanical efficiency. The Iron Warriors had conducted planetary assaults countless times across the Great Crusade, reducing the complex process to a series of precise, interlocking operations. Drop pods and landing craft were loaded, armored columns assembled in launch bays, artillery pieces secured for atmospheric descent. No questions were asked about the nature of their mission or the status of the planet below. The Legion had learned that such inquiries were unwelcome. As the deployment commenced, Perturabo received the first detailed scans of Olympia's surface. The data confirmed his suspicions. The planet was in open rebellion against Imperial rule. Damikos, the tyrant of Lakos and Perturabo's adoptive father, had died several years earlier, creating a power vacuum that destabilized the planet's political structure. In the ensuing chaos, anti-imperial sentiment, long simmering beneath the surface, had erupted into organized resistance. The rebellion had spread with remarkable speed, engulfing nearly every major city-state on the planet. Imperial administrators had been executed, their bodies displayed on the walls of the very fortresses the Iron Warriors had built to ensure compliance. Garrison forces, undermanned due to the Legion's commitments elsewhere, had been overwhelmed and destroyed. The few loyalist enclaves that remained were under siege, their supplies dwindling and their communications increasingly desperate. Most troubling to Perturabo was the fate of the Legion's recruitment facilities. The primary training center in Lakos had been overrun, its Astartes instructors killed and its equipment seized by the rebels. The next generation of Iron Warriors, young aspirants who had not yet received their full implants, had been massacred to prevent the Legion's reinforcement. This was not a spontaneous uprising, but a calculated attempt to strike at the Iron Warriors' future. The Primarch's response was immediate and unequivocal. There would be no negotiations, no attempts to understand the rebels' grievances or restore imperial authority through diplomatic means. Olympia had betrayed not just the Imperium but Perturabo himself, the planet that had exploited him in his youth, that had been given the honor of serving as the Legion's home world, had repaid these considerations with treachery. Such an offense could only be answered with absolute retribution. As the first wave of Iron Warriors made planetfall, they encountered fierce resistance. The rebels had appropriated Imperial weapons and equipment, including heavy artillery and armored vehicles. More significantly, they had intimate knowledge of the defensive systems the Legion had installed during Olympia's compliance. Fortifications designed to protect Imperial interests were now being used against their creators. Perturabo approached this challenge with the same methodical precision he applied to all military problems. He established a command center in one of the few remaining loyalist strongholds and began a comprehensive analysis of the rebellion's structure. Within hours, he had identified the primary leadership nodes, supply caches, and communication networks that sustained the uprising. With these targets plotted, he developed a strategy not merely to defeat the rebels, but to break Olympia's capacity for future resistance. The campaign that followed would become one of the darkest chapters in the Iron Warriors' history. Perturabo divided his forces into specialized task groups, each assigned specific objectives within his overarching strategy. Some were tasked with securing critical infrastructure, spaceports, power generation facilities, water purification plants. Others were given purely military targets, rebel strongholds, weapon caches, training camps. A third category received the most chilling assignments, population centers identified as sources of rebel support. The Iron Warriors attacked with a fury that shocked even those who had witnessed their previous compliance actions. Drop pods slammed into the heart of rebel-held cities, disgorging Astartes who advanced through urban centers with flamer and bolter, making no distinction between armed combatants and civilians. Terminator squads breached hardened bunkers where resistance leaders had established command posts, killing everyone inside regardless of their role or status. Artillery batteries, positioned on surrounding mountains, rained destruction on settlements that had shown any support for the rebellion. Most horrifying was the Legion's treatment of captured rebels. Unlike other compliance actions, where prisoners might be interrogated for intelligence or conscripted into Imperial service, Those taken on Olympia received no such consideration. Public executions became commonplace, with hundreds of captives killed at once to break the morale of those who remained in resistance. Some grand battalions went further, engaging in practices that bordered on ritual torture, rebels crucified along mountain roads, families forced to watch each other's slow deaths, entire villages buried alive in mass graves. Through it all, Perturabo directed the campaign with detached precision. He reviewed casualty reports and territory acquisitions with the same clinical interest he might show toward ammunition expenditure or fuel consumption. When officers reported atrocities committed by their forces, he neither condemned nor praised such actions. He simply assessed their effectiveness in suppressing resistance and adjusted his strategy accordingly. The few within the legion who privately questioned the scope of the violence found themselves assigned to the most brutal operations, forced to participate in actions that would silence their doubts or end their lives. Veterans who had served since before Perturabo's arrival, who remembered when the Iron Warriors fought with purpose beyond mere efficiency, found themselves increasingly marginalized. This was not a compliance action but a punishment, not a restoration of imperial authority but a vengeful annihilation. As the campaign progressed, the nature of the rebellion itself became clearer. The uprising had begun not as a coordinated movement, but as a series of localized protests against imperial tithes and conscription practices. These initial demonstrations had been met with harsh suppression by the planetary governor who had succeeded Damikos, triggering escalating cycles of resistance and crackdown. What might have been resolved through policy adjustments or limited military action had been allowed to fester into full-scale insurrection. More personally significant to Perturabo was the role played by his adoptive sister, Caliphone. Unlike many of Olympia's nobility who had fled off-world when the unrest began, she had remained, attempting to mediate between imperial authorities and the increasingly desperate population. When these efforts failed, she had reluctantly sided with the rebels, not out of hatred for the Imperium, but from concern for Olympia's people. Her name appeared on numerous resistance manifestos, her voice recorded in broadcasts calling for Imperial forces to withdraw from the planet. This perceived betrayal struck Perturabo more deeply than he would acknowledge. Caliphone had been his only genuine connection during his youth on Olympia, the one person who had treated him as more than a tool or curiosity. Her decision to stand against the Imperium against him confirmed his darkest suspicions about human nature and loyalty. If even she would turn against him, then no bond could be trusted, no relationship valued above duty. When Perturabo's forces finally cornered Caliphone in the mountain fortress that had once been their childhood home, the Primarch went personally to confront her. What transpired between them was witnessed by none save the two siblings, but when Perturabo emerged, he ordered the fortress razed to its foundations, with all inside to be put to death. Those who saw him in the aftermath noted a change in his demeanor, not the cold anger that had driven the campaign thus far, but something deeper and more fundamental, as though some final restraint had been broken. The destruction of Olympia accelerated after this encounter. What had begun as a targeted military operation to suppress rebellion transformed into systematic extermination. Cities that had already surrendered were subjected to orbital bombardment. Mountain valleys where survivors had taken refuge were flooded by redirecting rivers or sealed and filled with toxic chemicals. Agricultural areas were contaminated with substances that would render them barren for generations. The Iron Warriors were no longer simply killing rebels. They were erasing Olympia's capacity to sustain human life. Throughout this escalating horror, Perturabo maintained precise documentation of the campaign's progress. Every action was recorded, every death counted, every structure destroyed cataloged with bureaucratic thoroughness. This clinical approach created a cognitive distance between the Primarch and the atrocity he was committing. He was not destroying his homeworld, but solving a complex logistical problem, not exterminating a population, but removing a strategic threat to imperial stability. As the campaign entered its final phase, with resistance reduced to scattered bands of survivors hiding in the most inaccessible mountain regions, Perturabo received word that changed the context of the entire operation. Astropathic messages from distant Terra brought news of Horus's rebellion against the Emperor. The War Master had declared the master of mankind unfit to lead humanity and had called upon his brother Primarchs to join his cause. The Imperium was fracturing, with legions declaring for one side or the other in a conflict that would reshape the galaxy. This news reached Perturabo as he stood amid the ruins of Lakos, the city-state where he had spent his youth. The once proud mountain fortress had been reduced to rubble, its population decimated, its cultural treasures looted or destroyed. Similar scenes of devastation stretched across Olympia's surface, visible from orbit as massive scars upon the planet's face. The Iron Warriors had achieved their objective. Rebellion had been crushed, imperial authority restored through the most absolute means possible. But in the context of Horus's rebellion, the campaign took on new significance. Perturabo now faced a choice that would define his legacy and the future of his legion. The Emperor would surely demand an accounting for the destruction visited upon Olympia, not because of the suffering inflicted, but because such an action exceeded the authority granted to a Primarch. Worlds might be brought to compliance through force, but the near extermination of an established imperial planet, especially one that served as a legion home world, represented a breach of protocol that could not go unanswered. Horus, by contrast, would understand the necessity of Perturabo's actions. The War Master had always recognized the Iron Warriors' value when the Emperor seemed to take their service for granted. He had acknowledged Perturabo's strategic genius when others dismissed him as merely efficient. Most importantly, Horus offered something the Emperor never had: recognition of the sacrifices the Fourth Legion had made in thankless service to the Imperium. The decision crystallized in Perturabo's mind with the same cold clarity that characterized all his calculations. Logic dictated his course. The Emperor would punish him for Olympia. Horus would reward him for his loyalty. The Emperor had used the Iron Warriors as expendable tools. Horus promised to value them as irreplaceable assets. The Emperor had given Perturabo sieges and garrison duty. Horus would give him purpose and respect. As the last pockets of resistance on Olympia were eliminated, Perturabo gathered his senior officers aboard the Iron Blood. The meeting was brief and to the point. The Primarch laid out the strategic situation, the choices available to the Legion, and his decision. There would be no debate, no consideration of alternatives. The Iron Warriors would declare for Horus, bringing their unmatched siege expertise to the War Master's cause. The response from his officers was not enthusiasm, but grim acceptance. Many harbored private doubts about turning against the Emperor, but none would voice such concerns after witnessing their Primarch's ruthlessness on Olympia. Others recognized the pragmatic logic of Perturabo's decision. The Legion had crossed a line from which there was no return to imperial favor. A few welcomed the opportunity to finally receive the recognition they believed had long been denied them. As the Iron Warriors' fleet prepared to depart Olympia's orbit, Perturabo issued one final order regarding the planet below. Massive orbital platforms would be constructed in stable positions around the world, equipped with weapons capable of rendering the surface uninhabitable at a moment's notice. These platforms would serve as both monument and warning, a reminder of the price of betrayal and a guarantee against future rebellion. Olympia would remain a Legion recruitment world, but its population would exist under the perpetual threat of extinction. The psychological impact of the Olympia campaign on the Iron Warriors cannot be overstated. A legion already defined by bitterness and resentment now added guilt and self-loathing to its emotional burden. Warriors who had participated in the atrocities found various ways to process their actions. Some embraced the cold logic that had justified the slaughter. Others compartmentalized their experiences, while many simply surrendered to a fatalistic acceptance that they were damned beyond redemption. For Perturabo himself, Olympia represented the final severing of his humanity. The destruction of his homeworld, the execution of his sister, the betrayal of his oath to the Emperor, these actions transformed him from a bitter, underappreciated son to something harder and more terrible. The Lord of Iron had lived up to his title, becoming as unyielding and unforgiving as the metal itself, but at the cost of whatever capacity for joy or connection he might once have possessed. As the Iron Warriors' fleet translated into the warp, setting course to join Horus's growing armada, they left behind a world broken beyond repair, and a path that could lead only to damnation or vindication. The die was cast. The Lord of Iron had made his choice, gambling that the War Master's victory would finally bring his legion the recognition it deserved. Whether this decision would prove wisdom or folly remained for history to judge, but one thing was certain: there could be no return to what had been before. The shadow of Olympia would follow Perturabo and his sons forever, a darkness from which they could never fully emerge. The void between stars offered Perturabo little comfort as the iron blood translated back into real space. The decision had been made. The Iron Warriors had declared for Horus. There would be no forgiveness from the Emperor for the devastation of Olympia, no redemption in the eyes of those who remained loyal. The path forward led only through the War Master's victory, and Perturabo had committed his legion fully to that cause. News of the Iron Warriors' allegiance reached Horus with remarkable swiftness. The War Master understood the value of adding such formidable siege specialists to his forces, and wasted no time in summoning Perturabo to his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. This meeting would set the course for the Lord of Iron's role in the rebellion that was rapidly engulfing the galaxy. The Vengeful Spirit hung in the void like a predator, its massive frame bristling with weapon batteries and launch bays. As Perturabo's shuttle approached, he noted the modifications made to the vessel since he had last seen it: additional armor plating, reconfigured weapon systems, and strange, unsettling iconography that seemed to shift when viewed directly. The changes reflected the transformation of its master, a transformation Perturabo would soon witness firsthand. Horus received his brother in his stratageum, a vast chamber dominated by hololithic displays showing the disposition of loyalist and traitor forces across the galaxy. The War Master had changed since their last meeting. His physical presence remained commanding, but there was something different in his eyes, a depth of knowledge and purpose that transcended his former self. Power radiated from him in almost palpable waves, the gift of his new patrons in the warp. The War Master wasted no time with pleasantries. He laid out his strategic vision for the rebellion, identifying key targets and timelines for their conquest. The Imperial Palace on Terra represented the ultimate objective, but numerous other strongholds would need to be neutralized before the final assault could begin. Many of these were fortresses of legendary strength, designed to withstand conventional attacks indefinitely. Perturabo immediately grasped the nature of the task being offered. Horus needed him not merely as another general, but as his master of siegecraft, the architect who would break open the Imperium's most formidable defenses. Where other Primarchs might lead frontal assaults or command fleet actions, Perturabo would apply his unmatched analytical mind to the problem of fortifications specifically designed to resist such attacks. The assignment appealed to the Lord of Iron on multiple levels. It acknowledged his unique expertise, placing him at the center of the rebellion's most critical operations. It offered opportunities to demonstrate his superiority over Rogel Dorn, whose defenses would ultimately face Perturabo's methods of attack. Most importantly, it gave him purpose, clear, defined objectives that utilized his abilities to their fullest extent. Horus understood his brother's psychology with uncanny precision. He spoke of the Emperor's failure to recognize Perturabo's genius, contrasting it with his own appreciation for the Iron Warrior's capabilities. He described how Imperial historians had minimized the Fourth Legion's contributions while celebrating the achievements of the Imperial Fists. He promised that in his new order, Perturabo would receive the recognition and respect his talents deserved. The War Master's words found fertile ground in Perturabo's mind. The Lord of Iron had spent decades nursing grievances against an Imperium that treated his legion as expendable tools. Now Horus offered not just validation but elevation, a chance to transform from unappreciated servant to indispensable ally. The decision to join the rebellion, made initially from pragmatic necessity after Olympia, now gained emotional justification. Following this initial meeting, Perturabo immersed himself in planning for the campaigns ahead. He established a command center aboard the Iron Blood, transforming its stratagem into a nexus of analytical capability. Banks of cogitators processed tactical data from across the galaxy, while dedicated teams of Iron Warriors officers specialized in different aspects of siege warfare, artillery deployment, undermining operations, assault sequencing, and defensive neutralization. The Lord of Iron approached rebellion with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized all his military operations. He reviewed the specifications of every major imperial fortification, identifying structural weaknesses and defensive gaps. He analyzed the command tendencies of loyalist officers, noting patterns that could be exploited. He evaluated the capabilities of his fellow traitor Primarchs, determining how their particular strengths could be incorporated into comprehensive siege strategies. This analytical work quickly proved its value. When traitor forces encountered unexpected resistance at the fortress world of Manichea, Perturabo developed a precision targeting protocol that neutralized its void shields with minimal expenditure of munitions. At Vanaheim, his undermining strategy collapsed the primary defensive line from below, allowing Mortarian's Death Guard to breach the inner citadel with minimal casualties. Each success reinforced Horus's decision to make Perturabo his siege master. The Iron Warriors' reputation spread among both traitor and loyalist forces. To their allies, they became known as the Breakers of Walls, the legion that could overcome any defense. To their enemies, they represented methodical inevitability. Once the Iron Warriors appeared before a fortress, its fall became merely a matter of time. This reputation was cultivated deliberately by Perturabo, who understood the psychological value of perceived invincibility. Beyond tactical contributions, Perturabo's engineering genius transformed the traitor war machine in fundamental ways. He redesigned assault vehicles to better withstand defensive fire, modified artillery pieces for increased range and accuracy, and developed specialized equipment for breaching operations. His innovations extended to naval warfare as well, with new boarding techniques and void shield penetration methods that enhanced the traitor fleet's effectiveness. Perhaps his most significant contribution was the standardization of siege protocols across all traitor forces. Perturabo developed comprehensive doctrines covering every aspect of siege warfare, from initial reconnaissance to final assault. These were distributed throughout Horus's forces, ensuring that even legions without siege expertise could effectively reduce enemy fortifications. This standardization dramatically increased the rebellion's momentum, allowing multiple objectives to be pursued simultaneously without requiring Perturabo's direct oversight. The Lord of Iron's relationship with his fellow traitor Primarchs evolved during this period. With Horus, he maintained a professional distance, respecting the War Master's authority while avoiding the sycophancy displayed by some of his brothers. Horus, in turn, treated Perturabo with careful consideration, always framing requests as strategic necessities rather than orders, acknowledging the Lord of Iron's pride and need for recognition. With Mortarian, Perturabo found unexpected common ground. Both Primarchs valued efficiency and resilience, approaching warfare as a mathematical problem rather than an opportunity for glory. The Death Lord's forces frequently worked alongside the Iron Warriors, with Death Guard infantry following paths cleared by Iron Warriors' siege equipment. This partnership proved particularly effective against heavily fortified targets, combining the Death Guard's implacable advance with the Iron Warriors' breaching expertise. Angron presented a different challenge. The Red Angel's uncontrollable bloodlust made coordinated operations difficult, as the World Eaters would frequently abandon carefully planned assault sequences in favor of frontal attacks. Perturabo adapted to this liability by developing what he termed controlled breach strategies, creating multiple entry points in enemy defenses and allowing Angron's forces to choose their own paths of attack while the Iron Warriors secured critical objectives amid the chaos. The relationship between Perturabo and Fulgrim became notably strained after the Emperor's Children's transformation. The Lord of Iron found Fulgrim's increasing hedonism distasteful and his reliability questionable. When joint operations were unavoidable, Perturabo assigned the Emperor's children to diversionary roles, limiting their ability to disrupt his carefully calculated plans. Fulgrim, absorbed in his own pursuit of perfection through excess, seemed unconcerned by this transparent manipulation. Throughout these early campaigns, Perturabo maintained meticulous documentation of the Iron Warriors' contributions to the traitor war effort. Every fortress breached, every defensive system neutralized, Every innovation implemented was recorded with obsessive precision. This archive served multiple purposes: as a tactical reference for future operations, as evidence of the Legion's value to Horus's cause, and as a rebuke to the historical neglect the Iron Warriors had suffered under Imperial chroniclers. The Lord of Iron's strategic vision extended beyond immediate military objectives to the broader goal of reaching Terra. He recognized that the ultimate target, the Imperial Palace, represented a fortification challenge unlike any other in the galaxy. Designed by Rogel Dorn and incorporating the most advanced defensive technologies available to the Imperium, the palace would require unprecedented methods to breach. In preparation for this eventual confrontation, Perturabo directed portions of his legion to attack fortifications specifically designed by the Imperial Fists. Each such engagement provided valuable insights into Dorn's defensive philosophy, revealing patterns and preferences that could be exploited when the traitors finally reached Terra. The Iron Warriors meticulously cataloged these findings, building a comprehensive understanding of their ultimate opponent's methods. This focus on the eventual confrontation with Dorn manifested in Perturabo's personal preparations as well. He spent hours studying hololithic projections of the Imperial Palace, identifying potential weak points and approach vectors. He developed theoretical attack scenarios and ran thousands of simulations, adjusting variables to account for different defensive configurations. This obsessive planning bordered on the pathological, revealing the depth of Perturabo's fixation on proving his superiority over his rival. The Iron Warriors' effectiveness as siege specialists was enhanced by technological innovations that emerged during this period. Perturabo established forge complexes on conquered worlds, directing Mechanicum adepts who had joined the rebellion to develop specialized equipment for breaching operations. These facilities produced weapons of unprecedented destructive capability, massive siege drills capable of penetrating adamantium barriers, artillery pieces with ranges measured in hundreds of kilometers, and demolition charges that could collapse structures previously considered indestructible. Beyond conventional technology, the rebellion offered access to more esoteric methods of warfare. The warp powers that had elevated Horus provided new possibilities for undermining defenses, methods that bypassed physical barriers through dimensional manipulation. Perturabo approached these capabilities with characteristic pragmatism, viewing them as additional tools rather than replacements for proven techniques. He incorporated warp-based strategies into his siege doctrines when their effectiveness could be verified, but never relied on them exclusively. The early heresy campaigns revealed Perturabo's evolving approach to warfare. While he maintained the mathematical precision and attention to detail that had always characterized his methods, he now displayed a willingness to accept greater risks when potential rewards justified them. Operations that might have been rejected as too costly under Imperial command were now approved if they advanced the rebellion's timeline. This shift reflected both the urgency of Horus's campaign and Perturabo's growing fatalism about his legion's future. This fatalism manifested in the Iron Warriors' increasing disregard for their own casualties. Warriors were expended in operations where their sacrifice offered tactical advantage, their deaths calculated as acceptable losses in Perturabo's grand equations. The legion that had once resented being treated as expendable by the Imperium now imposed that same valuation upon itself, viewing individual lives as resources to be spent in service to efficiency. The Iron Warriors' transformation extended to their appearance and equipment. Their once pristine armor became increasingly modified with practical improvements, additional ablative plating, enhanced targeting systems, specialized breaching tools integrated directly into gauntlets and pauldrons. These modifications reflected the Legion's focus on functionality over form, prioritizing combat effectiveness over ceremonial appearance. More disturbing were the psychological changes evident in the Legion's warriors. The bitterness that had long characterized the Iron Warriors calcified into something harder and more absolute, a conviction that the galaxy itself was fundamentally flawed, that existence was merely a problem to be solved through the application of sufficient force. This nihilistic outlook made them perfect instruments for Horus's rebellion, warriors who would execute any order without moral hesitation. Throughout this early period of the heresy, Perturabo maintained communication with his fellow traitor Primarchs through a network of secure channels established by the War Master. These exchanges were primarily tactical in nature, coordinating movements and sharing intelligence, but occasionally revealed glimpses of the relationships developing between the rebel leaders. Mortarian's messages were terse and functional. Angron's were often incoherent with rage. Fulgrim's became increasingly concerned with aesthetic matters irrelevant to military operations. The most significant communications occurred directly with Horus, who regularly consulted Perturabo on strategic matters beyond siege warfare. The War Master recognized the Lord of Iron's analytical capabilities and solicited his assessment of loyalist movements and capabilities. These consultations fed Perturabo's sense of validation. Here, finally, was a leader who appreciated the full range of his abilities rather than viewing him merely as a tool for breaking walls. As the rebellion gained momentum, Perturabo's role expanded beyond purely military functions. Conquered worlds required governance systems to extract resources for the war effort, and the Lord of Iron applied his organizational genius to this challenge. He established efficient administrative structures that maximized production while minimizing oversight requirements, allowing the traitor forces to sustain their advance without becoming bogged down in occupation duties. The early phase of the heresy thus revealed Perturabo as not merely a participant in Horus's rebellion, but one of its primary architects, a strategist whose contributions extended far beyond siege warfare to encompass the fundamental organization of the traitor war machine. Without the Lord of Iron's methodical approach and analytical brilliance, the rebellion might have stalled before reaching its ultimate objective. With these capabilities directed toward Terra, the fate of the Imperium hung in the balance, dependent on whether Rogel Dorn's defenses could withstand the methods of the Master, who had joined Horus's cause. The aftermath of the Horus Heresy left the galaxy in ruins. While the Emperor sat entombed upon the Golden Throne and the Imperium struggled to rebuild, Perturabo retreated with his legion to consolidate their position. Unlike many of his traitorous brothers who fled to the Eye of Terror immediately, the Lord of Iron executed a more calculated withdrawal. He had unfinished business, a final reckoning with his most hated rival. Rogel Dorn, ever loyal to the Emperor, had taken upon himself the burden of fortifying what remained of the Imperium. The Praetorian had sworn an oath to rebuild the Imperial Palace, stronger than before. This single-minded dedication to duty made him predictable to Perturabo, who understood that certain provocations would elicit specific responses from his brother. The Iron Warriors Primarch began formulating a trap that would exploit this predictability, a masterwork of siege engineering that would come to be known as the Iron Cage. The world of Sebastus IV was chosen with meticulous care. An unremarkable planet in a strategically insignificant system, it offered the perfect canvas for Perturabo's design. The world possessed varied terrain, mountain ranges, river valleys, arid plateaus, providing diverse conditions for the construction of his labyrinth. More importantly, it was distant enough from major imperial strongholds to allow sufficient time for the trap to be sprung before reinforcements could arrive. Construction began immediately upon the Iron Warriors' arrival. Perturabo personally designed the fortification complex, applying every principle of defensive architecture he had mastered over centuries of warfare. What emerged was not a traditional fortress, but a deliberately flawed defensive system, a massive, interconnected network of trenches, bunkers, redoubts, and artillery positions that covered nearly 800 square kilometers. The genius of the design lay in its calculated imperfections. Each fortification contained subtle weaknesses that would be apparent to a skilled opponent like Dorn, inviting specific approaches and tactics. These weaknesses, however, were themselves traps, false vulnerabilities that would channel attackers into prepared killing zones. The entire complex was a mathematical equation expressed in ferrocrete and adamantium, designed to solve for the variable of Rogel Dorn's tactical doctrine. Perturabo incorporated psychological elements into the physical architecture. The outermost defenses featured Imperial Fist's helmets mounted on spikes, many belonging to warriors who had fallen during the Siege of Terra. Banners captured during previous engagements were displayed prominently, deliberately desecrated to provoke emotional responses. Vox casters were positioned throughout the complex, programmed to broadcast taunts and challenges specifically crafted to enrage the Sons of Dorn. The internal layout of the fortification network followed a pattern that Perturabo termed recursive degradation. Each defensive line appeared more vulnerable than the last, creating the illusion of imminent breakthrough that would draw attackers deeper into the complex. What seemed like tactical success would actually be strategic entrapment, as each advance would stretch supply lines and separate assault units from supporting elements. Fire lanes were arranged with mathematical precision, creating overlapping fields that could be adjusted as the battle progressed. Artillery positions were established with pre-calculated firing solutions for thousands of potential enemy movements. Ammunition depots were positioned to provide optimal resupply while remaining protected from counter-battery fire. Every aspect of the complex was designed to maximize Iron Warriors' combat effectiveness while degrading that of their attackers. Perhaps most insidiously, Perturabo incorporated knowledge of Imperial Fist's doctrine into the physical structure of the fortifications. Positions that would typically be designated as priority targets according to Dorn's tactical manuals were specially reinforced and equipped with additional defensive capabilities. Approach vectors that Imperial Fist's assault doctrine favored were pre-sighted by heavy weapons teams with interlocking fields of fire. As construction neared completion, Perturabo deployed his legion throughout the complex according to a carefully calculated distribution. Unlike a conventional defensive operation, where forces would be concentrated at critical junctures, the Iron Warriors were spread throughout the labyrinth in seemingly illogical patterns. This distribution was designed specifically to fragment attacking forces, drawing them deeper into isolated engagements where their numerical advantage would be neutralized. The final element of the trap was the bait. Perturabo arranged for rumors to reach Imperial intelligence networks, suggesting that the Iron Warriors were constructing a new Legion fortress on Sebastus IV. Other information indicated that the Primarch himself supervised the project, bringing with him valuable archaeotech and tactical data recovered during the heresy. Most crucially, carefully placed informants reported that the fortifications were incomplete, presenting a rare opportunity to strike at the traitor legion while they were vulnerable. When these reports reached Rogel Dorn, his reaction was precisely as Perturabo had anticipated. The Praetorians saw an opportunity to deal a decisive blow against one of the most dangerous traitor legions, while simultaneously avenging the damage they had inflicted during the Siege of Terra. Despite counsel from his senior officers suggesting caution, Dorn committed nearly the entire Imperial Fist's legion to the assault on Sebastus IV. The Imperial fleet arrived in system with typical efficiency, establishing orbital superiority with minimal resistance. Preliminary bombardment of the Iron Warriors' position revealed another element of Perturabo's design. The fortifications appeared to suffer significant damage from orbital fire, creating the impression that they were indeed incomplete and vulnerable. In reality, the visible structures were sacrificial elements covering hardened bunkers below, which remained entirely intact. Rogel Dorn led the assault personally, deploying his legion in a massive drop pod assault aimed at what appeared to be the weakest section of the Iron Warriors' perimeter. The initial landing secured their objectives with minimal casualties, reinforcing the perception that the traitors had been caught unprepared. As the Imperial Fists pushed inward, they encountered increasing resistance, but continued to make what seemed like steady progress through the defensive rings. The trap began to close as the Imperial Fists advanced deeper into the complex. What had appeared to be a conventional fortress revealed itself as a labyrinth specifically engineered to fragment attacking forces. Company commanders found their units separated by seemingly minor obstacles that channeled them into isolated pockets of resistance. Communication became increasingly difficult as the Iron Warriors activated signal jammers concealed throughout the complex. Perturabo observed the battle from a central command bunker, monitoring the movement of Imperial units through surveillance systems integrated into the fortifications. he made minor adjustments to the deployment of his forces, shifting reserves to exploit developing vulnerabilities in the Imperial Fist's advance. Unlike Dorn, who led from the front in accordance with his legion's traditions, the Lord of Iron directed the battle with cold detachment, treating it as a mathematical problem to be solved rather than a contest of martial prowess. By the third day of the engagement, the true nature of the Iron Cage became apparent to the Imperial Fists. What had seemed like a conventional assault against a fixed position had transformed into a nightmarish struggle for survival within an environment designed specifically for their destruction. Ammunition began to run low, as supply lines were systematically cut by Iron Warriors strike teams. Wounded accumulated in makeshift field hospitals that themselves became targets for precision artillery strikes. The psychological aspects of Perturabo's design proved as effective as its physical architecture. Imperial Fist squads found themselves confronted with the desecrated remains of their battle brothers, triggering emotional responses that compromised tactical discipline. Vox casters broadcast the sounds of Imperial Fists being tortured in nearby chambers, drawing impulsive rescue attempts that led into prepared ambushes. Even the environment itself seemed designed to erode morale, with lighting systems that created disorienting shadows and acoustic features that distorted sound. Rogel Dorn recognized the trap too late to withdraw without catastrophic losses. The Imperial Fists were committed to a battle of attrition within a labyrinth designed by the galaxy's foremost siege engineer. The Praetorian adjusted his strategy, abandoning the original assault plan in favor of consolidating his forces for a breakout attempt. This reaction had been anticipated by Perturabo, who had positioned his reserves specifically to counter such a maneuver. The battle devolved into hundreds of isolated engagements throughout the complex, with Imperial Fist squads fighting desperately to link up with their battle brothers. Iron Warriors' forces maintained disciplined fire patterns, focusing on inflicting casualties rather than securing territory. Every Imperial Fist killed represented an irreplaceable loss, while the Iron Warriors operated according to calculated attrition ratios that preserved their overall combat effectiveness. Perturabo had designed the Iron Cage not merely to kill Imperial Fists, but to break them, to force Dorn's warriors to compromise the rigid code of honor that defined their legion. As supplies dwindled and casualties mounted, Imperial Fist's captains faced impossible choices between abandoning wounded battle brothers or expending precious resources to evacuate them. The Sons of Dorn, who prided themselves on never retreating, found themselves in a position where advance meant destruction and withdrawal was increasingly impossible. The psychological impact on Rogel Dorn himself represented perhaps the most significant achievement of Perturabo's design. The Praetorian, who had prided himself on his mastery of defensive warfare, found himself comprehensively outmaneuvered by his most hated rival. The fortifications he had dismissed as flawed revealed themselves as a masterwork of siege engineering, incorporating insights into Imperial Fist's doctrine that could only have come from years of obsessive study. As the battle entered its second week, the situation for the Imperial Fists became increasingly desperate. Ammunition for bolters was strictly rationed, forcing many warriors to rely on combat blades and improvised weapons. Medical supplies were exhausted, leaving the wounded to suffer without palliative care. Most critically, water reclamation systems began to fail as the Iron Warriors systematically targeted environmental support infrastructure throughout the complex. The Imperial Fists might have been annihilated entirely had the Ultramarines not arrived to extract them. Robute Guilliman, recently appointed as Lord Commander of the Imperium, had recognized the strategic folly of committing an entire legion to what was essentially a punitive expedition. The Ultramarines' intervention forced Perturabo to adjust his calculations. While he could potentially destroy both legions, such a victory would come at a cost the Iron Warriors could ill afford in their post-heresy state. The extraction of the Imperial Fists from the Iron Cage was itself a grueling operation. Ultramarines' drop ships descended into prepared landing zones established by the beleaguered defenders, while covering fire from orbiting vessels suppressed Iron Warriors' artillery positions. The evacuation took nearly 3 days, with rearguard units fighting desperately to hold perimeter positions as their battle brothers withdrew. The cost to the Imperial fists was staggering. Nearly a third of the Legion lay dead within the iron cage, their gene seed unrecoverable. Hundreds more warriors were so severely wounded that even their superhuman physiology could not fully heal the damage. Beyond the physical losses, the psychological impact was perhaps even more significant. The Sons of Dorn, who had prided themselves on their mastery of siege warfare, had been comprehensively outmaneuvered by their most hated rivals. For Perturabo, the iron cage represented a validation of his methods and a vindication of his grievances. He had demonstrated conclusively his superiority over Rogel Dorn in the discipline both Primarchs had claimed as their specialty. The battle had not merely damaged the Imperial fists militarily, but had struck at the core of their identity, forcing compromises with their code of honor that would haunt them for centuries. The tactical brilliance displayed in the construction and execution of the iron cage cemented Perturabo's reputation as the foremost siege engineer in the galaxy. The complex represented the culmination of his approach to warfare, a perfect synthesis of mathematical precision, psychological manipulation, and pragmatic brutality. Every aspect of the fortifications had been designed with specific purpose, creating a system where each component reinforced the effectiveness of all others. In the aftermath, the Iron Warriors withdrew from Sebastus IV, leaving the complex as a monument to their Primarch's genius. The fortifications themselves were rigged with demolition charges that collapsed key structures, denying Imperial forces the opportunity to study Perturabo's methods in detail. What remained was systematically cleansed by Adeptus Mechanicus teams, who declared the entire area contaminated by warp influence to prevent further investigation. The Iron Cage marked the last major engagement between the Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors before the traitor legions retreated to the Eye of Terror. For Perturabo, it represented a fitting conclusion to his rivalry with Dorn, a final demonstration of his superiority in the art of siege warfare. The Lord of Iron had proven that his approach, based on mathematical precision and pragmatic efficiency, was ultimately more effective than his brother's adherence to tradition and honor. As the Iron Warriors' fleet translated into the warp, setting course for the territories that would become their domain in the post-Heresy galaxy, Perturabo reviewed the data from the engagement with characteristic thoroughness. Every aspect of the battle was analyzed, every casualty ratio calculated, every tactical adjustment evaluated for effectiveness. The results confirmed what he had always believed, that warfare reduced to its fundamental principles was simply a problem of engineering, and no one solved such problems more effectively than the Lord of Iron. The War Master's armada approached the Sol system with inevitable purpose, a vast collection of ships and warriors gathered for the final act of Horus's rebellion. At the heart of this force's strategic planning stood Perturabo, the master siege engineer whose expertise would be crucial in breaching humanity's most formidable bastion, the Imperial Palace on Terra. Perturabo had prepared for this moment since joining Horus's rebellion. His analytical mind had devoted countless hours to studying what intelligence existed about the palace's defenses, creating detailed theoretical models of its fortifications, and developing specialized siege equipment for this specific target. Now, as the traitor forces entered the solar system, theory would become practice in the most consequential siege in human history. The Lord of Iron established his command center aboard the Iron Blood, transforming the flagship Stratageum into a comprehensive planning facility. Banks of cogitators processed tactical data, while hololithic projectors displayed three-dimensional representations of Terra's defensive systems. Iron Warriors officers with specialized expertise in different aspects of siege warfare, artillery deployment, undermining operations, void shield penetration, and assault sequencing, worked in coordinated teams, each focusing on their assigned sector of the palace perimeter. Perturabo's first challenge was coordinating the disparate traitor forces into a coherent siege army. Each traitor legion brought different capabilities and limitations that needed to be integrated into the overall strategy. The World Eater's berserker fury made them ideal for breakthrough operations, but unsuitable for holding territory. The Death Guard's resilience allowed them to maintain pressure on defensive positions despite counterattacks. The Emperor's children, increasingly erratic in their pursuit of sensory extremes, could no longer be relied upon for disciplined operations, but excelled at exploiting breakthroughs. The Iron Warrior's Primarch approached this challenge with characteristic methodical precision. He assigned each legion responsibilities that matched their particular strengths while minimizing the impact of their weaknesses. Specialized formations were created that combined elements from multiple legions, allowing their capabilities to complement each other. Artillery support was allocated according to mathematical models that optimized firepower distribution across the entire palace perimeter. As the traitor fleet achieved orbital positions around Terra, Perturabo conducted his initial assessment of the palace defenses. What he observed confirmed his greatest concern: Rogel Dorn had been thorough in his preparations. The palace perimeter bristled with defense lasers, void shield generators, and artillery emplacements. Multiple defensive rings created depth that would force attackers to overcome successive fortified positions. Most notably, the defensive architecture incorporated redundant systems that could maintain integrity even if specific sectors were breached. Perturabo recognized his brother's hand in these preparations. The layered defenses, the overlapping fields of fire, the deliberate channeling of potential assault routes into prepared killing zones, all bore the hallmarks of Dorn's defensive philosophy. Yet the Lord of Iron also identified subtle weaknesses that his rival had either overlooked or been forced to accept due to time constraints. These vulnerabilities would become the focus of the Iron Warrior's initial operations. The first phase of the siege began with a systematic effort to degrade the palace's void shield network. Perturabo had developed specialized munitions specifically designed to stress shield generators beyond their operational parameters. Iron Warrior's artillery batteries deployed these weapons in precisely calculated firing patterns, concentrating on specific shield nodes rather than attempting to overwhelm the entire network simultaneously. This approach yielded incremental but significant results. Individual shield generators began failing under the sustained pressure, creating localized vulnerabilities that could be exploited by ground forces. Perturabo directed these attacks with mathematical precision, adjusting firing patterns based on real-time data about shield integrity and power distribution. The systematic degradation of the palace's outer defenses demonstrated the Lord of Iron's patient, methodical approach to siege warfare. As the void shields weakened, Perturabo implemented the next phase of his strategy: the deployment of specialized siege engines. The Iron Warriors had transported hundreds of these massive machines to Terra, many designed by the Primarch himself for this specific campaign. Massive Dreadbreaker siege drills capable of penetrating adamantium barriers, termite assault tunnelers that could bypass surface defenses entirely, and graviton ram tanks designed to collapse reinforced structures, all were deployed according to a carefully orchestrated timetable. The most impressive of these engines was the Tyrannos Terminatus, a mobile fortress that combined artillery platforms, troop transport capacity, and breaching equipment in a single massive vehicle. Perturabo had personally overseen its construction, incorporating technological innovations and tactical lessons from hundreds of previous sieges. The deployment of these behemoths along the palace perimeter signaled the beginning of concentrated breaching operations against the outer walls. Throughout these initial phases, Perturabo maintained constant communication with Horus, providing detailed assessments of progress and adjusting strategy based on the War Master's broader objectives. Unlike some of his brother Primarchs who chafed under Horus's authority, the Lord of Iron recognized the necessity of coordinated action. His reports were models of clinical precision, devoid of embellishment or excuse, focusing entirely on measurable progress toward defined objectives. The relationship between the two Primarchs had evolved since Perturabo's initial declaration for Horus. The Lord of Iron harbored no illusions about the War Master's transformation. He recognized that Horus had become something more and less than human, a vessel for powers that Perturabo understood only in terms of their tactical implications. Yet this awareness did not diminish his commitment to the rebellion. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had made his calculations and determined that victory under Horus, whatever he had become, remained preferable to defeat and punishment under the Emperor. As the siege progressed, Perturabo became increasingly aware of changes in the War Master. Horus's strategic directives began shifting from the methodical reduction of the palace defenses toward demands for immediate breakthrough, regardless of cost. The calculated patience that had characterized the rebellion's early phases gave way to an urgency that bordered on desperation. Something was driving Horus to accelerate the timetable, forcing compromises with the systematic approach that Perturabo had planned. These changes manifested in specific operational demands that the Lord of Iron found tactically questionable. Horus ordered concentrated assaults against heavily defended sectors, where more vulnerable points existed elsewhere. He demanded the commitment of reserves before breakthroughs had been properly secured. Most concerning to Perturabo, the War Master began overriding carefully calculated artillery deployment patterns in favor of mass bombardments that expended munitions at unsustainable rates. Despite these concerns, Perturabo adapted his strategies to accommodate the War Master's demands. The Iron Warriors redeployed their siege equipment to support the accelerated timetable, accepting higher casualty rates and reduced operational efficiency. Artillery batteries adjusted their firing solutions to concentrate on priority targets designated by Horus, even when tactical analysis suggested alternative approaches would yield better results. The Lord of Iron's pragmatism allowed him to modify his plans without abandoning the fundamental principles of his siege doctrine. This adaptation was tested severely during the assault on the Eternity Wall spaceport. This massive facility represented a critical juncture in the palace's outer defenses, its capture necessary for bringing heavier siege equipment into position against the inner walls. Perturabo had planned a methodical reduction of its defenses over several days, using a combination of artillery suppression, undermining operations, and targeted assaults to minimize casualties while ensuring success. Horus, however, demanded immediate results. The War Master ordered a massed assault using World Eaters as the primary attack force, supported by Iron Warriors breaching equipment and Death Guard follow-up units. Perturabo recognized the flaws in this approach. The World Eaters lacked the discipline for a coordinated breach operation, while the compressed timetable prevented proper preparation of assault routes. Nevertheless, he implemented the plan with characteristic thoroughness, adjusting supporting elements to compensate for its weaknesses. The resulting battle became one of the bloodiest engagements of the early siege. World Eaters' forces suffered catastrophic casualties against prepared defensive positions, their fury proving inadequate against Dorne's carefully designed killing zones. Iron Warriors' breaching teams found themselves exposed to concentrated fire without proper artillery support, their specialized equipment destroyed before it could be brought to bear against the spaceport's reinforced barriers. Despite these setbacks, the sheer weight of the traitor assault eventually secured the objective. The spaceport fell after 3 days of continuous fighting, its defenders overwhelmed by successive waves of attackers. The cost, however, far exceeded Perturabo's projections. Nearly 30% of the committed forces had been lost, including irreplaceable siege equipment that would be needed for later operations against the inner palace defenses. This pattern repeated across multiple sectors as the siege progressed. Horus's increasing impatience forced compromises with optimal siege doctrine, resulting in higher casualties and reduced operational effectiveness. Perturabo found himself caught between tactical reality and the War Master's demands, attempting to balance methodical progress with the need for immediate results. This tension began to strain the professional relationship between the two Primarchs, introducing an element of doubt into Perturabo's previously certain calculations. The Lord of Iron's growing concerns extended beyond purely tactical considerations. He observed troubling changes in the behavior of his fellow traitor Primarchs. Angron had devolved into a creature of pure rage, barely controllable even by Horus himself. Fulgrim appeared increasingly detached from military objectives, pursuing obscure personal agendas amid the carnage. Mortarion, once a reliable if dour ally, had become obsessed with spreading contagion rather than securing strategic positions. Most worrying was the transformation in Horus himself. The War Master's physical appearance had become increasingly mutable, his form shifting subtly depending on who observed him. His strategic directives grew more erratic, alternating between periods of brilliant clarity and seemingly irrational fixations. In their communications, Perturabo detected a fragmentation in Horus's thought patterns, as though multiple entities were competing for control of his decision-making processes. These observations led Perturabo to a troubling reassessment of his position. The rebellion he had joined, a movement ostensibly about recognition of merit and freedom from the Emperor's flawed vision, had transformed into something far different. The powers that had elevated Horus were revealing their true nature, and that nature appeared fundamentally inimical to the ordered, rational universe that Perturabo sought to create through his service to the War Master. This realization did not manifest as a crisis of loyalty, but as a pragmatic recalculation. The Lord of Iron had committed his legion to Horus's cause based on specific parameters and expectations. As those parameters shifted, so too did his assessment of potential outcomes. Perturabo began formulating contingency plans for various scenarios, including the possibility that the siege might fail or that victory might bring consequences different from those he had originally anticipated. Despite these private reservations, Perturabo maintained his external commitment to the siege operations. The Iron Warriors continued to lead breaching efforts against the palace defenses, their specialized equipment and tactics proving effective despite the compromises forced by Horus's accelerated timetable. The Lord of Iron personally directed key operations, his analytical mind finding solutions to the increasingly complex defensive systems they encountered as they pushed deeper into the palace perimeter. The most significant of these operations was the assault on the Saturnine Gate, a massive fortified entrance to the inner palace that Dorn had transformed into a death trap for would-be attackers. Preliminary analysis indicated that a conventional assault would result in unacceptable casualties, even with maximum artillery support and breaching equipment. Alternative approaches were necessary, and Perturabo developed a characteristically unconventional solution. Rather than attacking the gate directly, the Iron Warriors implemented what Perturabo termed a calculated circumvention strategy. Using modified termite tunnelers, they excavated a network of passages beneath the gate's foundations, carefully avoiding the detection systems that Dorn had installed to prevent exactly such an approach. These tunnels were not intended as assault routes, but as placement channels for massive demolition charges designed to collapse the entire gate structure from below. The operation proceeded with mathematical precision, each phase executed according to exacting timetables. Tunneling teams worked in synchronized shifts, their progress measured in centimeters to avoid triggering seismic detectors. Demolition specialists placed charges at precisely calculated structural weak points, each explosive linked to a central detonation system. Support teams established secondary tunnels for the assault forces that would exploit the breach once it was created. Human engineers might have failed in such a precise undertaking, but the Iron Warriors were transhuman specialists in siege warfare, guided by a Primarch whose understanding of structural mechanics approached the supernatural. The operation succeeded in placing the charges without detection, creating the potential for a catastrophic failure in what appeared to be an impregnable defensive position. When the charges detonated, the results exceeded even Perturabo's calculations. The Saturnine Gate collapsed into a massive crater, taking with it thousands of defenders, and creating a breach in the inner palace defenses that had not been anticipated in Dorn's defensive plans. For a brief moment, a genuine opportunity existed to penetrate to the heart of the palace and potentially end the siege in a single decisive operation. This opportunity, however, was squandered by the lack of coordination that had increasingly characterized the traitor forces. The World Eaters, acting without proper authorization, launched a premature assault into the breach before supporting elements were in position. The Emperor's children, assigned to provide flanking support, diverted to pursue their own obscure objectives in a nearby sector. Even the Death Guard, normally reliable in exploitation operations, advanced with inexplicable sluggishness, their movements hampered by some private directive from Mortarion. Perturabo observed this disintegration of command cohesion with cold fury. The breach at Saturnine represented the culmination of meticulous planning and precise execution, a textbook example of his siege methodology. Its failure to produce decisive results despite tactical success reinforced his growing conviction that the traitor forces were becoming fundamentally unreliable as military instruments. This assessment was confirmed in his subsequent meeting with Horus. The War Master, rather than addressing the command failures that had squandered the Saturnine opportunity, focused instead on accelerating the timetable for the final assault on the Emperor's sanctuary. When Perturabo presented data showing the unsustainability of such acceleration, Horus dismissed these concerns with a casualness that bordered on contempt. The conversation revealed that the War Master's priorities had shifted from military victory to some other objective, one that he either could not or would not articulate to his siege master. As the siege entered its final phases, Perturabo found himself increasingly isolated within the traitor command structure. The other Primarchs had either fully embraced the warp entities that empowered them or become so consumed by personal agendas that coordinated action became nearly impossible. The Iron Warriors remained effective as a military force, but their efforts were increasingly undermined by the strategic incoherence of the overall traitor offensive. The retreat from Terra marked a profound turning point for Perturabo and the Iron Warriors. As Horus fell and the Loyalist forces began their counteroffensive, the Lord of Iron executed a withdrawal that demonstrated his tactical acumen even in defeat. Unlike the chaotic flight of other traitor forces, the Iron Warriors disengaged in carefully coordinated phases, maintaining unit cohesion and preserving critical war materials. Artillery batteries provided covering fire for infantry formations, while specialized rearguard units delayed pursuers with prepared demolition charges and pre-sighted killing zones. Perturabo himself remained aboard the Iron Blood during this withdrawal, coordinating the Legion's movements with cold precision. His calculations incorporated not just immediate tactical concerns, but long-term strategic considerations: which assets to preserve, which positions to abandon, which forces could be sacrificed to ensure the survival of more valuable elements. The result was a retreat that minimized casualties while denying Loyalist forces the opportunity to destroy the Iron Warriors as a coherent fighting force. As the traitor armada scattered across the galaxy, Perturabo directed his fleet toward the fringes of the Imperium, avoiding both the immediate vengeful pursuit of Loyalist forces and the headlong flight into the warp that characterized other traitor legions. This measured withdrawal reflected his analytical approach. He would neither throw away his legion in futile last stands nor surrender to the chaotic influences that had corrupted so many of his brothers. The destination Perturabo selected was the Maladrak system, a relatively isolated region with minimal Imperial presence and natural resources sufficient to sustain his forces. The system's primary world featured extensive mountain ranges ideal for defensive fortifications, while its asteroid belt provided raw materials for shipbuilding and weapons manufacturing. Most importantly, its location at the intersection of several stable warp routes offered strategic flexibility, the ability to project power across multiple sectors or withdraw deeper into unexplored space as circumstances required. Upon reaching Maladrax, Perturabo immediately began establishing a defensive perimeter. Iron Warriors forces secured the system's navigational choke points, placing automated weapons platforms and sensor arrays to provide early warning of approaching vessels. On the primary world, construction teams began excavating fortress monasteries into the largest mountain ranges, creating self-sufficient strongholds that could withstand prolonged siege. These fortifications incorporated lessons learned during the Terra campaign, with redundant defensive systems and overlapping fields of fire that would make any assault prohibitively costly. While this work proceeded, Perturabo withdrew into seclusion aboard the Iron Blood. For 7 days, he remained in his personal forge laboratory, refusing all communications and denying entry even to his most trusted officers. The nature of his activities during this period remains a subject of speculation among Imperial scholars, but surviving accounts from Iron Warrior sources suggest he was engaged in intense calculation and analysis, reviewing the failed siege, assessing the Legion's current capabilities, and projecting potential futures based on available information. When Perturabo finally emerged, those who saw him noted subtle but disturbing changes. His physical appearance remained largely unchanged, but his presence had somehow intensified, his transhuman aura now carrying an undercurrent of something alien and disquieting. His eyes, always penetrating, now seemed to perceive dimensions beyond normal space, focusing on points that existed between visible objects. His voice, while still measured and precise, now carried harmonics that caused physical discomfort in those who heard it directly. The Lord of Iron gathered his senior officers in the Stratagem of the Iron Blood and presented his assessment of their situation with characteristic bluntness. The heresy had failed. Horus was dead. The Emperor, while grievously wounded, had survived. The Imperium would inevitably reorganize and launch punitive expeditions against traitor forces. The Iron Warriors, despite their relatively intact state compared to other traitor legions, lacked the resources to withstand a concentrated Imperial offensive. Survival, Perturabo concluded, required adaptation. The Iron Warriors could not defeat the Imperium through conventional warfare, but neither would he lead them into the madness that had consumed so many of his brother Primarchs. A third path existed, one that leveraged the Legion's strengths while acquiring new capabilities to address their vulnerabilities. This path would require sacrifice and transformation, but it offered the possibility of not merely surviving, but eventually prevailing against the Imperium that had exploited and discarded them. The nature of this transformation became apparent in the weeks that followed. Perturabo directed the Legion's Tech-Marine contingent to begin modifying their equipment according to new specifications he personally designed. These modifications incorporated technological principles that pushed against the boundaries of material science, creating weapons and armor that existed in an uncomfortable space between conventional technology and something altogether more esoteric. Simultaneously, the Primarch ordered the establishment of specialized research facilities throughout the Maladrax system. These installations, heavily fortified and isolated from regular Legion operations, focused on analyzing artifacts and materials recovered during the heresy. Of particular interest were items that demonstrated properties inconsistent with normal physical laws, objects that changed dimension when unobserved, weapons that caused wounds that would not heal, communication devices that transmitted information through means other than electromagnetic radiation. Most significant was Perturabo's directive regarding the Legion's relationship with the Warp. Unlike some traitor Primarchs who had embraced chaos worship as a path to power, the Lord of Iron approached the Imperium with the same cold pragmatism he applied to all strategic problems. He recognized the Warp as a source of energy and capabilities that could provide critical advantages, but he had also observed the corrosive effects of uncontrolled exposure on his brothers and their legions. The solution he developed was characteristically methodical, a system of controlled interaction with Warp energies that treated them as resources to be harvested rather than entities to be worshipped. Iron Warriors librarians, previously marginalized under the Nicaea Edict, were reorganized into specialized research cadres, tasked with developing techniques for channeling and containing Warp energy. Their work was strictly compartmentalized, with each team focusing on specific applications without knowledge of the broader program. This systematic approach to Warp utilization reflected Perturabo's fundamental nature. Even as he explored powers that defied conventional understanding, he sought to impose order and structure on them. The Imperium would become another tool in the Iron Warriors' arsenal, subject to the same rigorous analysis and precise application as their artillery batteries and siege engines. That this approach fundamentally misunderstood the nature of chaos would become apparent only later. The culmination of these preparations occurred approximately 2 years after the retreat from Terra. By this time, the Iron Warriors had established a secure domain in the Maladrax system, with multiple fortified worlds and void installations, creating a defensive network that could withstand significant Imperial assault. The Legion had reorganized into a more distributed structure, with grand battalions operating semi-autonomously while maintaining secure communication protocols with central command. Their equipment had been modified according to Perturabo's specifications, incorporating both technological innovations and controlled warp energy interfaces. On the primary forge world of the system, Perturabo personally oversaw the construction of a massive device that combined elements of traditional technology with components whose function defied conventional understanding. The structure occupied an entire mountain valley, its central apparatus surrounded by concentric rings of power generation systems and containment fields. Iron Warriors officers who participated in its construction reported that certain components seemed to shift position when not directly observed, while others required specific mental states from those handling them. When the device was completed, Perturabo ordered all Iron Warriors forces in the system to withdraw to predetermined defensive positions. Only a select cadre of officers and specialists remained with the Primarch at the central facility, each chosen for specific technical expertise or psychic sensitivity. For 7 days, these warriors participated in a process that combined elements of technological operation and ritual observance, following precise instructions that Perturabo had developed through his analysis of warp phenomena. The exact nature of this process remains unknown to Imperial authorities, with surviving accounts heavily redacted or corrupted by warp influence. What can be determined is that it involved the controlled release of enormous energy reserves, the sacrifice of thousands of human captives in precisely timed sequences, and the recitation of mathematical formulas that seem to function as both technical specifications and incantations. Throughout these procedures, Perturabo remained at the center of the apparatus, directing adjustments with the same exacting standards he applied to all Legion operations. On the 7th day, astronomical observation posts throughout the system recorded a localized distortion in real space centered on Perturabo's location. Vox communications became impossible within a 1,000-kilometer radius of the facility, while sensor systems registered energy patterns that overloaded their detection capabilities. Iron Warriors vessels in orbit reported visible manifestations in the atmosphere above the site, geometric patterns of light that rearranged themselves according to non-Euclidean principles, forming and dissolving with mathematical precision. When the distortion finally subsided, reconnaissance teams approached the facility with extreme caution. They found the valley transformed, the surrounding mountains twisted into impossible configurations, their surfaces covered with symbols that changed when viewed from different angles. The central apparatus had disappeared entirely, leaving a perfectly circular depression filled with a substance that resembled liquid metal, but behaved according to no known physical laws. Of Perturabo himself, there was no immediate sign. The officers who had accompanied him were found at equidistant points around the depression, each transformed in disturbing ways. Some had merged with their armor, technology, and flesh, becoming indistinguishable. Others had developed additional sensory organs that allowed them to perceive warp currents directly. All exhibited enhanced capabilities alongside profound psychological alterations, becoming the first of what would later be recognized as the Obliterator cult. 3 days after the event, as the Iron Warriors Leadership Council debated their next actions, Perturabo reappeared within his personal chambers aboard the Iron Blood. His return was not observed. Security systems simply registered his presence where moments before there had been nothing. When he summoned his senior officers, they found their Primarch fundamentally changed. Perturabo's physical form had undergone a transformation that defied complete description. His armor, once clearly distinguishable from his body, now appeared to be fused with his flesh, the boundary between the two becoming indeterminate. His proportions remained broadly humanoid, but incorporated elements that seemed to extend into dimensions beyond normal perception. Parts of his form would shift when viewed peripherally, stabilizing only when directly observed. Most disturbing were the mathematical symbols that continuously formed and dissolved across his surface, equations of impossible complexity that caused mental distress in those who attempted to comprehend them. Despite these physical changes, Perturabo's mind remained characteristically analytical and focused. He addressed his officers with the same precision and clarity that had always defined his command style, though his voice now carried undertones that resonated with the warp-sensitive in disturbing ways. He explained that he had achieved a synthesis, neither the uncontrolled corruption that had claimed Primarchs like Angron, nor the technological stagnation of the Imperium, but a directed evolution that preserved purpose while transcending material limitations. This transformation represented Perturabo's ascension to demonhood, though he himself rejected such terminology. In his analytical framework, he had not submitted to external entities, but had incorporated warp energy into his existing structure, maintaining his fundamental identity while acquiring new capabilities. That this perspective represented a profound self-deception, that the ruinous powers granted nothing without cost, would become apparent only gradually as the transformation's full implications manifested. The immediate effects of Perturabo's ascension on the Iron Warriors were both practical and symbolic. On a tactical level, their Primarch now possessed capabilities that transcended physical limitations. He could perceive vulnerabilities in enemy defenses that existed in dimensions beyond normal space, identify structural weaknesses through direct manipulation of probability fields, and calculate trajectories that incorporated warp currents into their solutions. These abilities made him an even more formidable siege master, able to overcome defensive systems that would have been impregnable to conventional analysis. More significantly, Perturabo's transformation established a template for the Legion's evolution. The Iron Warriors had always reflected their Primarch's methodical, analytical nature, and they approached his ascension with the same pragmatic assessment they applied to all strategic developments. They recognized the power it represented without surrendering to worship or blind emulation. Instead, they incorporated elements of his transformation into their existing doctrines, creating a hybrid approach that combined technological expertise with controlled warp utilization. This approach manifested in the Legion's equipment and organization. Iron Warriors began modifying their war machines to incorporate components that channeled warp energy in specific, limited ways, ammunition that created wounds that festered across multiple dimensions, sensors that detected enemy positions through probability analysis rather than physical detection, communication systems that transmitted information through controlled warp currents rather than conventional signals. These modifications were implemented according to strict protocols developed by Perturabo himself, designed to maximize tactical advantage while minimizing corruption. The Iron Warriors' fortress monasteries throughout the Maladrak system underwent similar adaptations. Their physical defenses were supplemented with warp-based countermeasures, approaches that seemed clear to outside observation but became labyrinthine when actually traversed, weapons that affected both material bodies and their warp reflections, containment systems that could imprison entities from either reality. These fortifications represented Perturabo's vision fully realized, the perfect synthesis of material engineering and immaterial manipulation, all subjected to rigorous analytical control. Despite these apparent successes, Perturabo's ascension contained the seeds of fundamental contradiction. The Primarch believed he had mastered chaos through application of logical principles, imposing his will on forces that defied rational understanding. In reality, the ruinous powers had simply accommodated his nature, allowing him to maintain the illusion of control while subtly redirecting his analytical brilliance toward their own incomprehensible purposes. The mathematical precision he prized became a different form of madness, calculations of perfect accuracy that led inexorably toward conclusions that served the gods he denied worshipping. This contradiction manifested in the Iron Warriors' subsequent campaigns. Their attacks on Imperial worlds displayed the same methodical efficiency that had always characterized their operations, but now incorporated elements of symbolic significance beyond mere tactical advantage. Fortifications were constructed according to geometric patterns that resonated with warp currents, creating defensive systems that affected attackers' perceptions and emotional states. Civilian populations were eliminated not merely to prevent resistance, but in carefully calculated patterns that generated specific psychic resonances in the Imperium. Perturabo himself rarely participated directly in these campaigns, having partly transcended the material limitations that bound him to specific locations. Instead, he directed Legion operations from his sanctum within the Iron Blood, which had itself been transformed into something that existed simultaneously in real space and the warp. From this nexus, he could perceive strategic developments across multiple sectors, identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities with a precision that bordered on precognition. When he did manifest physically, the effect on both allies and enemies was profound. Imperial forces facing Perturabo found their morale collapsing, as his presence imposed mathematical certainty on their defeat. Defense systems failed in cascading sequences, as he identified and exploited structural weaknesses that existed beyond normal perception. Even Space Marines, with their transhuman resilience to psychological warfare, experienced cognitive disruption when confronted with a being whose form incorporated equations that described their own destruction. The galaxy of the 41st millennium bears countless scars from 10,000 years of unending conflict. Among the most methodical architects of this devastation stands Perturabo, the demon Primarch of the Iron Warriors. Unlike many of his traitorous brothers who emerged from the Eye of Terror in sporadic, rage-fueled crusades, Perturabo's campaigns against the Imperium have maintained the cold, calculating precision that always defined him. Following his ascension to demonhood, Perturabo established Medringard as the central fortress of his legion within the Eye of Terror. This demon world reflects its master's nature perfectly, a planet-spanning network of citadels, manufactoria, and artillery emplacements arranged in mathematically perfect patterns. The skies remain perpetually choked with industrial pollutants, while the surface has been transformed into layer upon layer of fortifications that constantly reconfigure themselves according to their master's will. From this nightmarish stronghold, Perturabo has directed the Iron Warriors' long war against the Imperium with strategic patience uncharacteristic of most chaos forces. Rather than launching constant assaults, he emerges from the Eye of Terror at carefully calculated intervals, targeting Imperial worlds with precision strikes designed to maximize strategic impact while conserving his legion's strength. Each campaign follows meticulously developed plans that often unfold over decades, with initial operations laying groundwork for objectives that might not be realized for years. The Iron Warriors' emergence from the Eye typically begins with extensive reconnaissance conducted by specialized infiltration teams. These units, often supported by corrupted human agents, gather detailed intelligence on target worlds, defensive capabilities, garrison strengths, population centers, and strategic resources. This information is transmitted back to Medringard, where Perturabo's lieutenants analyze it to identify vulnerabilities and develop comprehensive assault plans. When the Iron Warriors finally strike, they do so with overwhelming force precisely applied. Drop pods and assault craft descend on critical infrastructure, void shield generators, communication arrays, defensive batteries, while specialized breacher teams target hardened command bunkers with equipment designed specifically for each objective. The precision of these initial strikes often cripples a world's ability to coordinate effective resistance before the main assault even begins. The pattern of Iron Warriors' attacks reveals Perturabo's strategic thinking. Unlike the World Eaters who might target heavily populated worlds for maximum bloodshed, or the Emperor's children who seek cultural centers to corrupt, the Iron Warriors prioritize targets with specific strategic value, forge worlds with production capabilities, agri-worlds that supply key Imperial sectors, or planets positioned at critical navigational junctures. Each conquest serves a calculated purpose within the Demon Primarch's broader plans. One of the most devastating examples of Perturabo's strategic approach occurred during the Hydra Caudatus campaign. This heavily fortified Imperial world housed a secret repository of gene seed from loyal Space Marine chapters, making it a target of immense value. Rather than launching a direct assault, the Iron Warriors first conducted years of infiltration operations, corrupting elements of the planetary defense force and placing sleeper agents throughout key facilities. When the attack finally came, it unfolded with mathematical precision. Orbital defenses were neutralized by precisely targeted lance strikes, while ground-based resistance was fragmented by simultaneous attacks on command and communication centers. The main Iron Warriors force, led by Warsmith Hansu, methodically reduced each defensive layer, while specialized extraction teams penetrated to the gene seed repository. The operation succeeded completely, with the Iron Warriors securing thousands of gene seed samples before withdrawing in good order. This methodical approach characterizes all of Perturabo's campaigns in the Long War. Each offensive incorporates lessons learned from previous engagements, with tactics constantly refined to counter Imperial adaptations. Iron Warriors forces maintain detailed records of all operations, creating a comprehensive database of Imperial defensive doctrines and their vulnerabilities. This institutional knowledge allows them to predict how Imperial commanders will respond to specific threats and develop counter-strategies accordingly. The Iron Warriors' periodic emergences from the Eye of Terror often coincide with broader chaos offensives, though Perturabo rarely coordinates directly with other traitor Primarchs. Instead, he exploits the distractions created by more impulsive chaos forces, targeting strategic objectives while Imperial defenses are focused elsewhere. During Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, for example, Iron Warriors strike forces attacked key fortress worlds in sectors adjacent to the Cadian Gate, drawing off reinforcements that might otherwise have strengthened the primary Imperial defensive line. Perturabo's campaigns reveal his continued obsession with proving his superiority over Imperial defensive doctrine, particularly that derived from Rogel Dorn's teachings. The Iron Warriors target Imperial Fist's fortress monasteries and defensive installations with particular focus, applying disproportionate resources to overcome these symbols of their ancient rivalry. Each such conquest is documented in excruciating detail, with performance metrics and efficiency calculations preserved in the Legion's archives as evidence of their Primarch's vindication. This fixation extends to the Imperial Fist's successor chapters as well. The Crimson Fists, Black Templars, and Executioners have all suffered targeted attacks by Iron Warriors forces seeking to prove their superiority over Dorn's lineage. These engagements often feature psychological warfare elements designed to undermine the morale of Dorn's descendants. Captured chapter relics displayed on Iron Warriors' war machines, broadcast recordings of defeated battle brothers, and tactical approaches specifically designed to exploit doctrinal weaknesses inherited from the Imperial Fists. The most significant of these confrontations occurred when Iron Warriors' forces under Warsmith Shantu launched a coordinated attack against the Crimson Fists during their period of rebuilding following the destruction of their fortress monastery on Rin's world. The campaign targeted not just the chapter's remaining military assets, but their recruitment infrastructure and gene seed repositories. Though ultimately repelled by the determined defense of the Crimson Fists and their Imperial allies, the attack demonstrated Perturabo's continued ability to identify and exploit moments of vulnerability in his enemies. Unlike some demon Primarchs who have become entirely consumed by their patron deity's nature, Perturabo maintains a disturbing level of strategic coherence. His campaigns show evidence of long-term planning and resource management, inconsistent with the typical behavior of chaos forces. The Iron Warriors maintain extensive manufacturing capabilities, both within the Eye of Terror and on corrupted forge worlds in real space, producing war machines and siege equipment to exacting specifications rather than relying solely on demonic manifestations or scavenged Imperial technology. This pragmatic approach extends to the Legion's relationship with human populations under their control, where the World Eaters might slaughter civilians indiscriminately or the Death Guard might subject them to horrific plagues. the Iron Warriors establish brutal but functional governance systems on conquered worlds. Populations are organized into labor units for construction and manufacturing, with production quotas enforced through methodical punishment systems. These worlds become extensions of Perturabo's workshop, producing war materials according to precisely calculated requirements. The Iron Warrior's fortress construction on captured worlds reveals Perturabo's continuing genius for defensive architecture, now enhanced by his demonic nature. These structures incorporate both physical and metaphysical defensive principles, walls aligned according to mathematical formulas that create reality distortions, weapon emplacements that exist partially in the warp until activated, and automated defense systems guided by bound demonic entities. Such fortresses prove nearly impossible to recapture once established, often requiring exterminatus to neutralize. Perturabo's current status within the hierarchy of chaos remains deliberately ambiguous. Unlike Primarchs like Mortarion or Angron, who serve as direct extensions of their patron deity's will, the Lord of Iron maintains a degree of independence that puzzles Imperial theologians. He appears to draw power from the warp itself, rather than any single chaos god, using his mathematical understanding of immaterium currents to harness energy without complete subordination. Whether this represents genuine autonomy or simply a more subtle form of corruption remains debated among Ordo Malleus scholars. This independence manifests in the Legion's religious practices as well. While individual Iron Warriors may develop personal devotions to specific chaos entities, the Legion as a whole maintains a pragmatic relationship with the ruinous powers. Demons are bound into war machines and fortifications through technical processes rather than religious rituals. Warp energy is harnessed through calculated formulas rather than emotional excess. This approach has allowed the Iron Warriors to maintain more coherent organizational structures than many traitor legions, with clear command hierarchies and strategic objectives. In the 41st millennium, with the galaxy split by the Great Rift, Perturabo's strategic position has strengthened considerably. The widespread warp disturbances have created new opportunities for expansion, while the division of Imperial forces has reduced their ability to respond coherently to Iron Warriors' incursions. Intelligence reports indicate increased Iron Warriors' activity along the boundaries of the Imperium Nihilus, where Imperial authority has weakened and defensive infrastructure has degraded due to isolation from Terra. The return of Roboute Guilliman as Lord Commander of the Imperium represents both challenge and opportunity for Perturabo's long-term strategy. The Avenging Sun's efforts to reorganize Imperial defenses and introduce new tactical doctrines threaten to counter advantages the Iron Warriors have exploited for millennia. Simultaneously, Guilliman's reforms have created transitional vulnerabilities as old systems are replaced, providing openings for precisely targeted attacks during the reorganization process. Most concerning to Imperial strategists is evidence suggesting Perturabo has begun adapting his tactical approach to counter Primaris Space Marines. Iron Warriors forces encountered in recent engagements have deployed specialized weapons designed to penetrate Mark X armor, while their assault patterns show awareness of Primaris combat doctrines. Captured Iron Warriors equipment reveals modifications specifically calibrated against the enhanced capabilities of these new Space Marines, indicating comprehensive analysis of their strengths and vulnerabilities. The future plans of the Lord of Iron remain characteristically opaque. Unlike Chaos Warlords who broadcast their intentions through grandiose proclamations, Perturabo maintains operational security that would impress even Imperial intelligence agencies. What can be discerned from the pattern of Iron Warriors' activities suggests a methodical strengthening of their position throughout specific sectors, particularly those with strategic manufacturing capabilities or access to ancient technologies. Inquisitorial analysis of recent Iron Warriors campaigns indicates increasing interest in Necron Tomb worlds and other sites of Xeno's technological significance. Several engagements have featured specialized Iron Warriors units targeting specific artifacts or data repositories rather than pursuing conventional military objectives. Whether this represents a new strategic direction or simply opportunistic acquisition of useful technologies remains unclear, but the implications of Perturabo gaining access to advanced Xenos knowledge are deeply troubling to Imperial authorities. Perhaps most disturbing are reports from the fringes of the Imperium suggesting Iron Warrior's forces have established cooperation with certain Dark Mechanicum factions specializing in forbidden technologies. These unholy alliances have allegedly produced new variants of demon engines that combine warp-based power sources with advanced mechanical systems beyond current Imperial understanding. If these reports are accurate, they indicate Perturabo is developing entirely new categories of weapons for future campaigns against the Imperium. As the 41st millennium progresses, the Iron Warriors remain one of the most methodical and dangerous threats to Imperial security. Unlike the spectacular, but often strategically limited attacks of other Chaos forces, Perturabo's campaigns follow calculated patterns designed for long-term advantage. Each world conquered, each fortress breached, each resource secured fits into comprehensive plans that may take centuries to fully manifest. The demon Primarch himself seldom appears directly in real space battles, though his presence is occasionally reported in particularly significant engagements. When he does manifest, Imperial forces face an entity of terrifying power whose understanding of siege warfare has been perfected over 10 millennia and enhanced by demonic ascension. Fortifications designed according to standard Imperial templates become death traps for their defenders as Perturabo identifies and exploits weaknesses with supernatural precision. 10,000 years after the heresy, Perturabo remains what he always was, the supreme siege engineer, the master of calculated destruction, the Lord of Iron whose cold logic reduces warfare to mathematical certainty. His long war against the Imperium continues without haste or fury, each campaign another step in plans whose full scope may be incomprehensible even to his own followers. As new threats emerge and old enemies return in the tumultuous 41st millennium, the Iron Warriors stand ready to exploit every vulnerability, their demonic Primarch watching from his impossible fortress as the galaxy burns according to his calculations.